My name's Drew. I'm originally from Nottingham, England, but in the summer of 2019, I was living in Toulouse, France. I had taken a year off work after my father passed away from cancer. He left me some money, and I needed time. Just time away from everything. I was 27, and I thought maybe some long solo trips would help clear my mind, maybe give me a bit of peace. That July, I decided to go camping in the Cévennes National Park. It's a massive, rugged place in the south of France, thick with forests, mountains, and winding rivers. A quiet spot, hours away from the cities, not overloaded with tourists. I picked it because it wasn't too far from where I was staying, but still felt wild and isolated. I brought a small tent, a decent sleeping bag, my old hiking boots, and just enough food to get me through 4 or 5 nights. I didn't want to stay in campsites with showers and cabins. I wanted real silence, just me, nature, and nothing else. I drove out in an old Peugeot I'd bought in Toulouse and parked it at a public hiking lot near a town called Le Pont de Montfort. From there, I hiked deep into the park. The first few nights were peaceful. I set up in a little clearing maybe 2 hours off any real trail, not far from a cold stream that wound through the valley. I saw deer tracks, heard owls, and caught the occasional rustle of wild boar in the brush. It was quiet enough at night that I could hear my own breathing. I didn't see another person for 3 full days. That was the point. I liked the quiet, liked waking up to sunlight bleeding through the walls of the tent, making coffee over a small camp stove, writing in a notebook, and just walking through the forest for hours. It didn't cure the sadness in me, but it quieted everything a little. Time slowed down. That was good. The 4th night, things changed. It started with something small. I was finishing a quick dinner, some canned lentils and bread, when I noticed something odd. A cigarette, but maybe 2 or 3 meters from where I'd pitched my tent. That might not sound like much, but I don't smoke, and I had been incredibly careful about not leaving trash around. This thing had been smoked down to the filter and stubbed out into the soil, still fresh, like it hadn't rained on it yet. I remember standing there, just holding my little metal camping fork, staring at that cigarette. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but the feeling that washed over me, it was like my body suddenly realized something my brain hadn't caught up to. I felt exposed, watched. I checked the area around my camp, making a slow, careful circle through the trees with a headlamp and a small folding knife in my hand. It was nothing, just night birds and the wind shifting through the trees. After 20 minutes, I convinced myself it had just blown in somehow. Maybe some hunter passed through days ago, and I just hadn't seen it until now. That kind of thing happens, right? I slept uneasy that night with my knife under my sleeping bag. Every snap of a twig made my heart beat faster, but eventually I dozed off. The next morning, I found a boot print not far from where the cigarette had been. Larger than mine, deep in the soil like someone had stepped there recently. The shape was different from my boots, more narrow, more pointed at the toe. Not an animal, a man's print. That was enough for me. I packed up my camp, strapped my gear back onto my pack, and decided I'd head closer to the trails. Maybe not all the way back to the car, but somewhere I wouldn't feel so isolated. I hiked for most of the day, covering steep, rocky ground, until I found a decent little flat spot near an abandoned stone shepherd's hut. It was crumbling, half covered in vines, just a square of mossy walls left behind. But it gave me a little peace of mind, like a human had once been here, and maybe that meant I wasn't completely alone. I set up my tent beside the hut and spent the rest of the afternoon reading and watching the treetops sway in the wind. The strange feeling from the night before lingered in the back of my head, but I was trying to stay rational. I kept telling myself this is nature, not a crime scene. That night, just after sunset, I saw him. I was lying in the tent with the flap unzipped, just listening to the night settle in. The stars were beginning to show through the canopy. I didn't have a fire going, too dry, too risky, so it was just darkness around me. Then I heard something, slow footsteps on leaves. Not scurrying, not a fox. Slow, deliberate. I froze, turned off my headlamp, and listened. The steps came closer. I could feel the sound through the ground. Then they stopped, maybe 10 meters from my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I stared out through the mesh flap, my eyes adjusting to the dark. That's when I saw him. A man standing between two trees. Not moving, just standing. He was tall, maybe over 6 feet, and thin, with a jacket that looked dark and loose, almost like a coat that was too big for him. I couldn't see his face clearly. It was hidden by shadow, but I could see that he was looking directly at me. He didn't say anything, didn't raise a hand, just watched. I stayed frozen. For minutes, my heart thudded in my chest like a drum. I thought if I stayed still long enough, maybe he'd just go. And after what felt like an eternity, he did. He turned, slowly, and walked back into the trees, 1 foot after another, deliberate and quiet. I waited another hour before I even moved. Then I zipped the flap, kept my knife in my hand, and didn't sleep a second that night. By dawn, I was packed. No breakfast, no water, no break. Just moving. I was done. I needed to get back to the car and leave. I told myself it was probably some hiker, some hermit, some hunter who didn't know how terrifying it is to approach someone at night like that. But in my gut, I knew something was wrong. That guy didn't look lost. He didn't look confused. He looked like he knew exactly where I was and what he was doing. I hiked fast and hard for hours, barely stopping to rest. I followed the trail back toward where I'd left the car, but the forest is thick in places, and the terrain twists around ridges and creeks. It's easy to get turned around. At one point, I realized I'd taken the wrong branch of a path, an animal trail, not a human one, and it dumped me into a low ravine filled with brambles and sharp rocks. I checked my map and compass, tried to reorient. I wasn't far off track, but I had to double back. That added another 2 hours. By the time I reached the small parking area, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. I felt this flood of relief seeing my little Peugeot still parked there. I tossed my bag into the back seat, jumped in, and started the engine. That's when I noticed something strange. The driver's side mirror was folded in. I didn't remember doing that. I always left them out. A small thing, but it made my stomach twist. Then I saw the scratch. A long, thin scrape along the passenger door. Fresh, not deep but clear. Someone had been near my car. I didn't wait. I pulled out and drove, fast, bouncing over the gravel, back toward Le Pont de Montfort. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. And even then, I kept checking my mirrors. I spent that night in a cheap motel, locked in a room with a deadbolt and my bag shoved up against the door. I never went back to that park. I never reported it. What would I even say? A man stood near my tent. A cigarette butt. A scratch on my car. None of it proved anything. And maybe that's what made it worse. There was no closure, no event, just signs, a feeling, a man watching me from the trees. I think about it often, not every day, but when I'm walking alone or camping again, closer to others now, never too far from a road. I sometimes catch myself glancing through the trees, and I wonder, was he following me for days? Did he know I was alone? Was he going to do something? Or was that night just a rehearsal for the next one? I don't know, but I trust my instincts now more than I ever did before. That man, whoever he was, he had no reason to be out there in the dark. And I'll never forget how still he stood, like he had all the time in the world. I never camp alone anymore. I was working a warehouse job back then in Des Moines, stacking pallets in the graveyard shift, 5 nights a week. It wasn't a bad job, but the fluorescent lights and concrete walls made me feel boxed in after a while. By the time August rolled around, I'd been working nearly 7 months straight without more than a day or two off. I was itching to be alone, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from anything that beeped, buzzed, or blinked. So I used 3 days of vacation and packed up my old Honda CR-V for a solo camping trip. I wanted isolation, so I skipped the regular state parks. I picked a small stretch of land I found on a hiking forum, privately owned, public access, no running water, and no cell signal. Just some open woods up near a dried-up river bend close to the Minnesota border, about 3 hours north. People said it was peaceful, full of deer and foxes, and mostly forgotten. That sounded perfect to me. I loaded up with enough food, water, and gear to last a few nights. Basic stuff: tent, sleeping bag, cooler, butane stove, trail mix, jerky, first aid kit. I brought a folding camp chair, a couple books, and an old .38 revolver my uncle had given me for safety. I'd never had to use it before, but it gave me peace of mind knowing it was there, tucked in the bottom of my duffel bag. The drive was smooth. Once I left the highway, it was just gravel roads and cornfields for miles. The last stretch was a rough dirt path, barely wide enough for the car. I followed it past a few rotting fence posts and into the treeline. I kept going until I hit a small clearing that sloped gently down toward the old riverbed. The whole place was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just trees standing still like they were holding their breath. I parked off to the side, killed the engine, and got out. The sun was still up, casting long shadows through the trees. Felt like stepping into another world. I walked the area a bit before setting up camp. The ground was dry but soft. No real signs of animals. Just a few scattered feathers and a half-buried raccoon skull near the base of a pine tree. It didn't bother me. You see that stuff in the woods all the time. I pitched the tent about 15 feet from the car, close enough to grab anything I needed, but far enough not to smell the gas. The fire pit had been used before. Someone had stacked a circle of rocks and left some blackened logs behind. I cleared it out and made a fresh pit just to be safe. That night, I made some instant rice and beans, sat in my chair, and watched the stars come out.
No sounds.
Not even crickets. I should have found that weird, but I didn't think about it too much. I've been waiting for silence like this for months. Around midnight, I crawled into the tent and zipped up. The fabric walls kept in the warmth, and my body relaxed fully for the first time in weeks. I drifted off quick. The first night was uneventful. I woke up early, sore from the hard ground but well rested. Made coffee with my little burner, ate a granola bar, then spent most of the day hiking along the dried river. The brush was thick in some places, but I had my knife and cleared through. I didn't see anyone. No footprints, no tire marks, no wrappers or beer cans. Felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd on my way back to camp. A tree about 50 yards uphill had a large, clean gash cut across its bark, deep and smooth, like someone had taken a hatchet or machete to it. The edges were fresh, no rot or bugs yet. I paused and looked around. Nothing but woods. I figured maybe another camper or hunter passed through recently and marked it for some reason. Still, something about it rubbed me wrong. It didn't look like a blaze mark. It looked like someone had been angry. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I made a fire that night, roasted a couple hot dogs, and kept the revolver close by just in case. The silence had started to bother me. I hadn't heard a bird since I got there. No rustling in the trees. Not even a single mosquito buzzed by. I sat still by the fire and stared out at the trees like they were staring back. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Not from fear, but from this strange heaviness in the air. Like something was watching me just beyond the edges of the trees. I didn't hear anything, but every few minutes I'd feel a prickle on the back of my neck. Once, I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight out, but there was nothing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Being alone for too long messes with your head. The next morning, I walked back up to the tree with the gash in it. The wound looked darker now. Something had rubbed against it. Mud, maybe. The base of the tree had scuff marks, like a boot had kicked around the roots. I looked down and spotted a piece of fabric caught on the bark. Frayed denim, like the torn hem of a pant leg. I felt uneasy. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood there for a while, just listening. Still no birds. I turned back and walked fast to camp, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate some dry snacks and climbed into my tent before the sun was fully down. The air felt heavy again. I left the revolver inside my sleeping bag. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. It was soft, but close. Something scraped against the outside of the tent. Not wind, not a branch. It was deliberate, slow and dragging, right across the nylon wall by my feet. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Then came another sound, closer to the zipper. A faint tap, like a knuckle brushing against the fabric. I reached for the revolver slowly, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. My fingers closed around the grip. I waited, counting the seconds. No more sounds. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and scanned the area. The fire pit was undisturbed. My cooler was untouched. Nothing looked moved. But near the back of the tent, I found a long smear in the dirt, like someone had knelt there and dragged a hand or a stick alongside the fabric. I also saw boot prints, not mine, bigger, deeper. They led off into the woods toward the hill. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, but I didn't drive off. Not yet. I had this strange need to know who it was, why they came so close without saying anything. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I felt like I needed to prove to myself that it wasn't what I thought it was. I followed the boot prints. They weren't fresh, maybe from the night before or earlier in the day. I moved slowly, watching every step. The trail led uphill, then flattened out near a stand of dead trees. In the middle of them was a small clearing and a tarp. A dirty, blue tarp half covered with pine needles and branches. I crept up and peeled it back. Underneath was a makeshift lean-to, with posts, bungee cords, a sleeping bag rolled up like it hadn't been used in days. A rusted coffee can sat next to an empty tuna tin, and behind it all, stacked neatly against a tree, were plastic bags, full of food wrappers, used wet wipes, cigarette butts. Whoever had been there, they'd been there a while. I looked around. There were no weapons.
No hay DS.
Just junk. But what chilled me wasn't the camp. It was a tree behind it. That same gash. Fresh, white. Same angle as the one I saw near my camp. And at the base of this tree, scratched into the bark with a knife or something sharp, were tally marks. Dozens of them, all in rows of 5. I don't know what they meant. Days, people, attempts. I didn't want to know. I turned and ran. Back at the car, I threw the rest of my gear in and peeled out down the dirt path, bouncing hard off rocks and ruts. I didn't stop until I hit paved road again. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following me out of the trees. I didn't call the cops. I didn't report anything. I don't know why. Maybe I should have. But I told myself it wasn't illegal to camp out there. Whoever it was, maybe they were just squatting. Maybe they just got too close. But something deep in my gut told me that person had been watching me from the moment I set up camp. Maybe longer. I never went back. I don't go camping anymore. And that revolver stays on my nightstand now, just in case. It was the fall of 2012 when I found myself on the outskirts of a small town in Maine. I had been driving for hours, needing to get away from the grind of life, work, people, everything. I was in my late 20s then, just barely out of a long, serious relationship. I thought camping would clear my head. Little did I know, this trip would leave me with more questions than answers. I had been to this graveyard once before, years ago, with my father. It was a place I knew well, tucked far behind the main road in a thick stretch of woods. I loved how secluded it was, a quiet place for reflection, where only a few people ever ventured. The cemetery wasn't large, just a few acres of rolling hills dotted with old, moss-covered gravestones. Some of them were so worn down by the years that you could barely make out the inscriptions. Perfect spot for someone who needed to be alone. I wasn't sure why I chose to camp there. Maybe it was the fact that it was one of those rare places untouched by the bustling noise of the modern world. Maybe it was the comfort of knowing there was a kind of peaceful stillness, like the cemetery had absorbed the noise of the world and kept it locked away. But as the sun began to dip low on that autumn evening, I found myself unloading my gear in the back of my truck, ready to set up camp under the fading light. I had brought a tent, my sleeping bag, a lantern, and some food for the night. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I didn't need much. The trees surrounding the cemetery were dense, their branches swaying in the light breeze. I could hear the rustling of leaves on the ground, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant sound of the creek that ran behind the cemetery. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to wrap around you, making everything feel smaller and more isolated. The first thing I noticed as I set up camp was the strange stillness in the air. It wasn't like the usual sound of wildlife you'd expect in the woods. There were no birds calling, no squirrels chattering in the trees, just the soft, persistent wind brushing against the leaves. I chalked it up to the time of year. Animals were probably hunkering down for the colder months. By the time the sun had set, the cemetery was bathed in a soft, eerie glow. I had a small fire going, the flames dancing in the cool air, crackling as the firewood burned. I ate my meal, a simple sandwich, and tried to push my thoughts away from the reasons I had come here in the first place. It had been hard to shake the feeling of restlessness that had taken root inside me, but I hoped the night would help. As the darkness grew thicker, I found myself staring into the shadows, my mind wandering. The wind picked up again, rustling through the trees. A strange noise, something faint but distinct, caught my attention. It sounded like a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like footsteps, but too soft and uneven to be anything human. I stood up, looking around, my hand instinctively reaching for the small knife I had brought with me. There was nothing, no one, just the wind. Still, the noise lingered in the back of my mind. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe an animal moving through the woods. I wasn't sure what it was, but I decided to ignore it, sitting back down by the fire. But then came another sound, louder this time, a thud. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It had come from behind the trees, somewhere near the edge of the cemetery. My first instinct was to stay put, to not make any noise, but curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, feeling the weight of the silence press against me. The light from the lantern flickered as I stepped toward the edge of the cemetery, my flashlight illuminating the ground ahead of me. As I moved, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had to swallow the growing lump in my throat, trying to calm myself. There was nothing to fear here. This was just a graveyard, after all. I walked further into the trees, the beams of my flashlight cutting through the thick, dark air. The path was narrow, lined with overgrown brambles. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, the quiet so thick it almost felt oppressive. Then I saw something, a figure, barely visible at first, standing just at the edge of the cemetery. It was tall, thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat. It didn't move at first, but I could sense it was aware of me. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't run. I wasn't sure what to do, what to think. Was it a person? Another camper? Maybe? I couldn't tell, but something about the figure seemed wrong. It was too still, too unmoving. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The figure didn't react, didn't move. I could feel my pulse racing as I called out, my voice breaking the heavy silence. "Hey, is everything okay?" There was no answer, only the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I felt my stomach tighten. Something was off. My mind began to race, and I quickly stepped back, the light from my flashlight casting wild shadows on the ground as I turned to leave. But then, just as I was about to turn back toward camp, I heard a voice, low and almost inaudible, coming from somewhere behind me. "Leave now." I froze. I didn't know where it came from. The voice didn't sound human, or at least not like any voice I'd ever heard before. It sent a chill down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to the safety of the fire and my tent. But I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The figure hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I could feel its presence in the dark, as if it were right behind me, even though I hadn't seen it move. I turned my head slightly, trying to catch a glimpse, but the figure was gone. Panic gripped me. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I bolted back toward the camp, my legs almost buckling beneath me as I ran. My heart raced, and I could feel the weight of the darkness closing in around me. Every noise sounded louder now. Every shadow seemed to loom longer, and I could almost hear the beating of my own heart in my ears. When I reached my tent, I didn't stop to think. I threw myself inside, zipping it up tight and collapsing onto my sleeping bag. My breathing was fast and shallow, my hands trembling as I gripped the sides of the bag. I tried to calm myself, but the fear wouldn't leave. The night dragged on in silence after that. The fire had long since burned out, and the only sounds that reached me were the wind outside, the occasional distant animal noise, and my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. I kept my eyes fixed on the small lantern that I had set near the entrance of the tent, the light flickering every now and then. I didn't sleep at all that night. How could I? After what had happened, I was too on edge. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. The sun was shining brightly, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that the previous night had just been a bad dream. I got up, packed my things, and decided to leave. As I was walking out of the cemetery, I noticed something odd. There was a fresh set of footprints near the spot where I had seen the figure the night before. They weren't there when I had arrived, and they weren't from my own boots. They were deep impressions in the soft earth, like someone had been standing there, watching me. I didn't stay to investigate any further. I loaded my gear into the truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I haven't been back to that cemetery since, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever was out there that night, whatever I felt watching me, it was real, but it wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or some fairy tale creature. It was just something else, something human but not. Something that made me realize that not all places are meant to be explored, and not all nights are meant to be spent alone in the dark. As I left that cemetery behind me, I couldn't help but think about how much I had learned. There are things out there in the world that we can't always understand. Some things we should never question. I was 26 when I decided to camp on the old Fisher property, a few miles outside the quiet town of Echo Hill, Kentucky. It was early October 2018, that kind of dull gray fall when the leaves turn but the sky stays cloudy for weeks. The land had once been a working farm, but the owners had moved away years ago. Some said it was still private, some said it was abandoned. Either way, I figured no one would notice if I stayed one night. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to be alone for a bit and get some quiet. My life had been stretched thin that year. I was working 55 hours a week at a landscaping job, living alone in a basement apartment, and going through the last gasps of a breakup that had left me burned out and tired of people. I needed to breathe, away from phones and cities and expectations. I didn't want to stay in a public campground either. Too many people, too much noise. That's why I picked Fisher Farm. I remembered it from when I was a kid. My uncle had taken me hunting out there before it shut down. There were still a few outbuildings, a falling down barn, and acres of wooded fields. The main house had long since been boarded up. No one lived within shouting distance. I packed light. A 2-person tent, a sleeping bag, my old army surplus pack with some jerky, canned chili, a water filter, flashlight, first aid kit, and my .38 snub revolver I kept for hiking. Not because I expected anything, but because I'd had one too many sketchy run-ins with feral dogs or sketchy people in the woods before. I also packed a cheap burner phone just in case, no GPS, but it had bars sometimes. I left my truck off the shoulder of Millersville Road and hiked in. It was about a mile up a muddy path through the woods before the land opened up to that old, wide field of dead grass and broken fence posts. You could still see the outline of where cows used to graze. The barn leaned hard to one side like it was bowing under its own weight, and the roof had mostly caved in. A long time ago, there'd been some machinery sheds and chicken coops. Now they were just piles of wood and rusted metal. I picked a spot near the far tree line, under some ash trees where the ground was soft but dry, and the view of the barn and open field was clear. I set up my tent there, put my gear inside, and spent the first hour walking the perimeter. The air smelled like dead leaves and wet dirt. I found a few animal trails, but nothing fresh. No tire marks, no footprints. I was alone. That was what I wanted. I cooked chili over my little backpacking stove, ate while leaning against a log, and watched the sky fade into that dull orange before everything turned blue and then black. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m. It wasn't cold enough for frost, but it got chilly quick. I left the rain fly open on one side so I could see the sky through the mesh. The night was quiet at first, just whined through the trees and the occasional snap of branches from deer or possums. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was an animal. It sounded like a faint dragging noise, then a rustle, then something like metal tapping against wood. I sat up, listened. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other night animal snooping around the camp. But after a few minutes, I realized it was coming from the direction of the barn. I crawled out of the tent quietly and stood barefoot on the cold ground, trying not to breathe too loud. The moon wasn't full, but bright enough to see the outline of the barn about 100 yards away. I didn't see movement, but the noises didn't match what I expected from a raccoon. The dragging noise came again, then silence. I waited, then walked back into the tent and zipped it halfway, sitting there with my hand resting on my revolver. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, the light made everything feel normal again. Birds started chirping. The wind picked up. I felt kind of stupid. I figured it had just been a deer rooting around the collapsed part of the barn or a branch scraping in the wind. Still, something felt off. I walked over to the barn after breakfast. The front doors were half gone, just rotted frames swinging loose. Inside, the dirt floor was covered in straw and rusted tools. There was a broken-down tractor, piles of wire fencing, and old buckets, but no fresh tracks. Nothing had been disturbed in a long time, except near the back corner, by one of the wall studs, I found something that made my skin crawl. There was a pile of bones, small ones, mostly rib bones and a few jaw fragments. Maybe raccoon, maybe something else. They'd been placed in a neat pile, not scattered like you'd expect from scavengers. And there were old cans around them. Empty soup cans, beer cans, some rusted, some not. One of them had a faded barcode that looked too new to have been there for more than a year or two, which meant someone else had been here recently. That was the first moment I thought maybe I wasn't alone after all. I backed out of the barn, keeping my eyes up, but I still didn't see anyone. Still, I felt watched. I told myself I was overreacting. Paranoia, city nerves. The woods will do that to you. But I made a mental note to be more alert. Around noon, I took a long hike toward the tree line on the west side of the property. The woods were thicker there, real overgrown. I found an old deer stand, half collapsed, probably 20 years old. But near it, I saw something I didn't expect. A trail, not a game trail. This one was man-made, narrow, but cleared in a way that suggested regular use. Branches had been snapped and moved. The dirt was packed. It led north, away from the farm and deeper into woods I didn't remember from childhood. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. It twisted for a while, crossing a shallow creek, then sloping uphill. Maybe a quarter-mile in, I found what looked like a small hunting camp. But it wasn't right. There was a tarp rigged between two trees like a shelter. Underneath, there was a blue cooler, a foldable chair, and some cutwood stacked in a neat pile. But it all looked too clean, too organized, and no one was there. I didn't touch anything, but I did check the cooler. It had 3 water bottles, some granola bars, and what looked like a few cans of tuna. Nothing labeled. No clothes, no ID, no trash. Whoever was using that spot was doing it on purpose and trying not to leave much behind. I walked back to camp, unsettled. It was clear now. I wasn't the only one using this land, and the other person didn't want to be known. I packed my bag lightly and kept the revolver on my hip the rest of the day. I wanted to leave, but part of me didn't want to seem scared. I figured I'd spend one more night and leave at first light. I locked up the food, double-checked the tent, and settled in around 8 p.m. I didn't light a fire this time. I wanted to stay hidden. That night, things got worse. Around 1 a.m., I woke to movement. This time, close. I didn't make a sound. I just sat up slowly, heart hammering. I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching dry leaves, moving along the tree-line near my tent. Then silence. Then the sound of someone breathing. Not animal breathing. Slow human breathing, just outside the tent. I froze, my hand wrapped around the grip of my revolver. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited, and after a minute, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep again. When dawn came, I packed everything in under 10 minutes. Tent, food, sleeping bag. I didn't eat, didn't even drink water. I just hauled everything back to the truck, eyes darting over my shoulder every 10 steps. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. When I got back to the road, my truck was still there, untouched, but wedged under the windshield wiper was something that hadn't been there before. A torn corner of cardboard, with one word written in red marker. Leave. I drove away without looking back. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. Eventually, I filed a report with the local sheriff, but nothing ever came of it. He said the Fisher place had long been considered private, technically owned by a bank but never patrolled. No one was supposed to be out there. He thought it was squatters or maybe a paranoid hunter. I never went back. That trip taught me something real about fear. It's not ghosts or shadows that get you. It's knowing someone else is out there, close enough to touch you, but hiding just out of reach. Someone who watches, waits, and doesn't want to be seen. I haven't camped alone since. I was 32 that summer, and it was early August 2021. I had a week off from work and needed to get out of the city. Things were too noisy, too packed. Between phone calls, emails, and the everyday rush of people in every direction, I was tired of the routine. I'd been meaning to take my dog, Milo, a 5-year-old chocolate lab, on a real camping trip for a while. We'd done weekend hikes, but never something longer, never just me and him for more than a night. So I picked a spot about 5 hours northeast of Boise, Idaho. It wasn't a park or a big campsite, just one of those remote areas with barely marked trails. It was called Ridge Trail, and it sat on the edge of some steep forested land that dropped off toward an old logging area. Nobody really went there much anymore. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just texted my brother, said I'd be out of cell range for a while. I packed up my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, extra tarps, food, dog food, first aid kit, stove, matches, flashlight, knife, water purifier, and enough dry food for 5 days. I had a backpack with essentials and a smaller one for short hikes. I also brought Milo's leash, though I never really used it. He stuck to me like glue. We drove up on a Wednesday morning. The last 40 miles were all gravel roads, narrow ones with barely enough room to pass. Trees lined both sides. After 2 hours of that, I found the Ridge Trail pull-off, which was just a dirt patch and a faded wooden sign with moss crawling up the base. The sun was still high, and the air smelled like pine and warm dirt. Milo was wagging like crazy when I opened the tailgate. He knew something good was coming. I parked the truck a little off the road, locked it up, and double-checked my gear. I wasn't planning to come back for 4 nights, so I had everything with me. The trail wasn't much more like a deer path than a human one, and it went straight into the woods. No markers after that first sign. That was one of the reasons I picked it. I didn't want to hear someone else's music through the trees, or see another fire pit 20 feet from mine. I wanted real quiet. We walked for about 2 hours, gradually gaining elevation. The trees got denser, but there were breaks in the canopy where the light poured in, golden and still. I found a flat patch near a small stream that trickled down from somewhere uphill. It wasn't big, but enough to fill a bottle. The place was quiet. I couldn't hear anything but the soft crunch of my boots on pine needles and the occasional rustle when Milo sniffed around in the brush. I set up camp, pitched the tent, laid out a tarp, gathered some rocks for a fire ring, and dug a small latrine trench about 50 yards from the tent. Everything felt right. Milo sniffed and marked his area, then lay down in the shade, panting and watching squirrels skitter in the trees. That first night was peaceful. I made soup on the little stove, fed Milo, then sat by the fire as the stars came out. It got cold fast, so I zipped up and pulled Milo inside the tent with me. He curled up at my feet. I remember thinking how perfect it felt. No noise, no light but the stars, just the crackling fire and my dog breathing steady in the dark. The next day, I hiked out east from the camp, just exploring. I kept my pack light, water, knife, snacks, and a first aid kit. Milo stayed close, sometimes running ahead, but always looping back to check on me. We followed the stream for a while, which led down into a shallow ravine, then back up toward a patch of broken rock. There were some old deer bones scattered near a tree, picked clean. Nothing weird, just nature doing what it does. I didn't see any sign of people. No trash, no broken bottles, not even boot prints. I liked that. On the way back, maybe a mile from camp, Milo stopped. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just froze. His ears went up, tail stiff. I looked ahead but didn't see anything. I knelt beside him and listened. It was completely quiet, like the kind of silence that's too still. No birds, no wind, just still. Then it passed. Milo relaxed and kept walking. I brushed it off. Probably caught a whiff of something. Coyote or bobcat, maybe. I didn't think too hard on it. That night, I built another fire, bigger this time. Something about that silence earlier had left me a little on edge. I wanted the light. I wanted the crackling sound. Milo kept looking out into the trees as if he expected something. He didn't bark or seem scared, but he was alert, more than usual. I fed him double, hoping to settle him down. We slept fine, though I woke up once around 3 a.m. and thought I heard movement outside, like light footfalls through the brush, but it was gone as fast as it came. Milo was asleep. I figured I was imagining things. The third day, I decided not to go far. Just stayed around camp, cleaned up, organized gear, and collected drywood. Around noon, I heard something strange, like a metal clinking noise, faint, maybe 100 yards out. It wasn't consistent, just one or two sharp sounds like metal tapping rock. I stood still for a long time listening. It didn't repeat. Milo didn't react much, so I let it go. I thought maybe a tree branch had fallen onto something. Sound travels weird in the woods. Around dusk, I saw something that didn't fit. I was standing near the stream, cleaning a pot, and looked up toward the ridge behind camp. I noticed a flash of color between two trees. It was quick, maybe 10 seconds. A flicker of orange, like fabric. Not a bird or animal, too still. Just one solid flash. Then it was gone. Milo didn't bark, but his hackles raised. I dropped the pot and stared into the trees, straining my eyes. Nothing moved. I walked up that way about 30 feet, calling Milo quietly with a gesture. He came reluctantly. I scanned the brush, looked for footprints, anything, nothing. But the feeling stuck with me, that something was out there, watching. I didn't light a fire that night. I sat inside the tent with the flap zipped shut, just listening. Milo stayed right beside me, quiet and alert. Around midnight, I heard that clinking again, closer this time, then silence. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. Something was off. It wasn't panic, but a growing unease, like the woods weren't mine anymore. Like I'd walked somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I packed up slowly, methodically. I didn't want to seem rushed, even though my hands were shaking a little. I could feel eyes on me. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. We started hiking back toward the truck. I checked the GPS a few times, keeping to the trail. About halfway through, I found a tree with a fresh cut in it. Not natural. A single axe mark, deep, old style. The bark was split wide and fresh sap bled down the side. That hadn't been there before. I walked past it fast, hand on my belt knife. Then Milo growled. Not loud, but low, deep, like I'd never heard from him. I turned. He was looking behind us, tail low, shoulders tense. I followed his gaze. I saw nothing, but the trees were tight and shadowed. I didn't wait. We moved faster. I kept checking behind us, half expecting someone to step out. But no one came. We reached the truck in late afternoon. The vehicle was untouched, exactly how I left it. I opened the doors fast, got Milo inside, and started the engine. As we pulled out onto the gravel road, I looked once into the trees. Something moved, not fast. Just a slow shifting shape behind the trunks, far back. Too far to see clearly. I didn't stop. That night I stayed in a cheap motel outside a town called Warren. I locked the door, pulled the curtains, and lay in bed with Milo beside me. He was calm again, but I wasn't. I kept thinking about the orange flash, the axe mark, that clinking sound. I told myself it was a hunter, maybe a local living off-grid, maybe someone who didn't want to be seen. But deep down, it felt worse than that. It felt like I had walked too far into someone else's territory. The next morning, I drove home. I didn't tell anyone much, just said the trip was fine, got some fresh air, hiked a bit. I didn't want to explain what I couldn't explain. I deleted the GPS route. I didn't post any pictures. I haven't camped alone since. Milo's older now, grayer, but still sticks close. Sometimes when I take him out to the park or the woods, he'll stop and stare into the trees. And every now and then, that same still silence settles over everything, like the woods are remembering. And I always turn around. I don't think I'll ever go back to Ridge Trail. Not because I saw something I can't explain, but because I saw just enough to know I don't need to see more. I didn't belong out there. Not that deep, not that far. And I got out just in time. It was the summer of 2016 when I took a break from work and planned a camping trip with my old friend Daniel. We'd known each other since we were kids growing up in Central Oregon, though he'd moved down to Arizona after high school and became a cop. I stayed in Portland and worked in a warehouse, nothing glamorous. Life pulled us in different directions, but we always tried to meet once a year. Just the two of us, somewhere far from people, far from traffic, far from anything that made noise or had a screen. That year, Daniel suggested a spot about 2 hours northwest of Sedona. It wasn't an official campground, just a quiet patch of forest with a creek nearby, some game trails, and enough space to pitch 2 tents. He'd found it while on a solo hike the year before, said it was the most peaceful place he'd ever been. I trusted him. Cops see all the worst parts of the world, so when they say something feels peaceful, you take it seriously. I took a week off and flew down. He picked me up in his truck. Still the same beat-up silver Tacoma he'd had in high school. His gear was stacked in the back. Tents, tarps, sleeping bags, cooking supplies, even a bow he liked to use when he hunted. He was always more of an outdoorsman than me. I was just there to disconnect. No phones, no emails, no bosses yelling at me. The drive took longer than I expected. After Sedona, we took a series of dirt roads that narrowed the deeper we went into the hills. Daniel had printed out topographic maps in case we lost signal, which we did halfway there. The forest got thick around us, dense with pines, cottonwoods, and sharp gray rocks jutting out from the slopes. The road eventually became little more than a pair of tire ruts threading through the trees. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing surrounded by high ridges and thick brush. A narrow stream flowed along the edge, shallow and clear. There were signs of deer around, tracks, droppings, some bark rubbed clean off saplings. The place felt untouched, quiet. We set up camp. Daniel handled the tents while I gathered firewood. The air was dry but cool, and the silence felt deep. Not the empty kind of silence you get in the suburbs at night, but the heavy kind where you realize just how far away from everything you really are. The first night passed easy. We ate beans and rice, drank a couple beers we kept cold in a cooler with dry ice, and stayed up watching the stars. I don't remember what we talked about. Mostly old stories, dumb things from our teens, bad dates, bad jobs, the kind of stuff that made us feel like the world hadn't changed too much, even though we both knew it had. The next morning, Daniel said he wanted to do a long hike up the ridge to the west. I didn't feel like climbing anything steep, so I stayed behind. I was happy just being alone, doing nothing. I read for a bit, whittled a stick with a pocket knife, cleaned up camp. Around noon, I got restless and decided to walk down along the creek. It ran north for a while and then curved back into the trees. I figured I'd follow it for a mile or two and then head back before he returned. I didn't bring anything with me, no phone, no water, just me and the woods. The creek narrowed after a while, and the banks rose up steep on either side. I stepped over stones, ducked under low branches, watched lizards dart across the warm rocks. Then I came to a spot where the creek cut through a rocky bend. There was a strange smell in the air, faint but sharp, like rot, but not strong enough to make me gag. I thought maybe something had died nearby, maybe a deer. It wasn't uncommon, especially this deep in the woods. I kept walking, but the smell got stronger. A few minutes later, I saw it. At first I thought it was just a pile of clothes, dark, heavy, partially hidden beneath a tangle of branches and dead leaves near the creek. But something about the shape didn't look right. I stopped. My heart thumped once, heavy and cold. I stepped closer, slowly. It was a man, or what had been one. He was lying on his side, half curled, knees bent like he'd fallen that way. His clothes were torn. Jeans and a faded jacket stained dark with old blood and dirt. One shoe was missing. His face was turned away, but I could see part of the jawbone exposed where animals had torn away the skin. His hand was stretched out in front of him, fingers bloated and stiff. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Everything in my body wanted to back away, to turn around and run. But I didn't. I crouched down and stared. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to see details. The gashes in his clothing, the swelling in the limbs, the flies circling his head. His skin had turned grayish blue. The smell was worse now, sweet and sour and thick. I had no idea how long he'd been there, but it wasn't fresh. A week, maybe more. I backed away slowly. My hands were shaking. I didn't run, but I walked fast, straight back to camp, eyes scanning the trees like someone might be watching. Daniel was back when I returned. He saw my face and stood up fast. I didn't say anything. I just pointed toward the creek and nodded. He didn't ask questions. He went straight to his pack, pulled out a small notepad and his phone, then took his sidearm and clipped it to his belt. Instinct, habit, training. We walked back together, this time slower. He moved like he was clearing a room, checking brush, scanning treetops. When we reached the body, he crouched next to it and stared. He didn't touch anything. Male, he muttered to himself. White, mid-30s. Looks like he's been here a while. No ID visible. Then he stepped away and looked around. That's when he saw the boot prints. They weren't mine. They were deeper, wider, maybe 2 pairs heading off into the woods away from the creek. He followed them a short distance, then stopped when the trail vanished into dense underbrush. We didn't talk. He led the way back to camp and opened up the emergency satellite beacon he kept for his solo hikes. He pressed the red button, which triggered a distress signal to the nearest ranger station. Said someone would respond within 6 to 10 hours depending on terrain. Could even be the next day. The sun was going down. We had no choice but to stay one more night. Daniel barely slept. I didn't either. Every sound in the forest made my skin crawl. The crack of a branch, the rustle of a breeze. We sat by the fire until it burned low. He cleaned his pistol and kept it close. I held my knife like it meant something. To first light, we packed everything up. Daniel didn't want to move far in case a search team came, but he also didn't want to stay that close to the body. We found a small rise about 200 yards away and waited. Around noon, we heard the helicopter. 2 rangers came down on a line, along with a sheriff's deputy. Daniel showed his badge and explained what we'd found. I stayed quiet. They asked a few questions, then hiked down to the site. An hour later, a second team arrived on foot with stretchers and equipment. They worked quickly and silently. When they carried the body up, I looked away. Turns out the man had been missing for 9 days. His name was Travis Elliott, from Flagstaff, had a record, minor drug stuff, some theft. Nothing violent. His car had been found at a trailhead 20 miles away. No sign of anyone else. The authorities suspected a drug deal gone bad, or maybe he'd crossed the wrong people. There were no cameras, no signals, no way to trace what happened. The only clues were those boot prints, and even those were shallow, disappearing fast in the dry dirt. Daniel gave a full statement. They thanked us and offered to escort us back to the road. We accepted. I didn't want to spend another minute out there. The ride back was quiet. Neither of us said much. I flew home the next day. Daniel stayed behind to help with the investigation. Said he felt like he owed it to the guy. That's the kind of person he is. Cop or not, he never looked away from ugly things. It's been years since that trip, but I still think about it sometimes. Not just the body, not just the smell or the stiff hand reaching forward like it was trying to grab something. I think about how easy it was to disappear out there. How one wrong path, one bad decision, and you could end up face down in the dirt with nobody knowing your name. I haven't been camping since. Daniel and I still talk, though less often now. He transferred to a different city. Said the woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. I know what he means. The world's quiet out there. Too quiet sometimes. Quiet enough that if someone screamed, no one would hear. And if someone killed you, you might not be found until your skin turns gray and the animals come. It was the summer of 2019. I was 34 years old at the time, working as a freelance field tech based out of Kansas City. I'd spent the better part of June and July either in front of my laptop or crammed into the front seat of my truck, answering calls, fixing tower issues, or installing satellite relay setups. It wasn't hard work, not exactly, but it was relentless. Always someone needing something done. I kept telling myself I'd take a break soon. Then I realized I'd burned through 2 months without ever stopping to breathe. So I decided to take a week off. No work, no service calls, no signal tests. I packed a duffel, loaded the back of the truck with my camping gear, grabbed my cooler and my Glock just in case, and started driving north.
No GPS, no real plan.
Just a map, my instinct, and a quiet desire to disappear into the woods. 3 hours out, I turned off the main highway, then onto a narrowing back road that sloped past farmland and old barns. I wasn't looking for a campground or anywhere with signs. I wanted something quiet, untouched. Eventually, I found it. A gravel logging road off Route 18 that wasn't marked anymore, covered in tall grass and thick brush like no one had used it in years. I turned in anyway, crunching slowly over the broken stone until the trees closed around me and the trail spit me out at a clearing that overlooked a low bluff above a stagnant river bend. The water was wide but lazy, more brown than blue, its banks lined with cattails and tree stumps. It didn't even ripple. There were no boats, no houses, no other campers. Just me, my truck, and the silence. I parked off to the side under a large oak. The sun was starting to drop behind the tree line. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the edge of the bluff, just far enough to be safe if the ground gave. Then I started a small fire in the pit, cooked a few sausages, and cracked a beer from the cooler. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until I felt my shoulders ease. The air smelled like dry grass and river mud. The only sounds were cicadas and the distant splash of frogs. Felt good. I stayed out by the fire until close to midnight. No phone, no music, just the crackling of the flames and the slow stretch of night around me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I fell asleep almost instantly. But I didn't stay asleep. I woke up maybe an hour later, around 1 a.m. There was no noise, not at first. Just the dead stillness that wakes you up like something's wrong. I lay there, breathing slow, trying to figure out what snapped me out of sleep. Then I heard it, a rustle soft and close. Not wind, not an animal rooting around either. It was slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath. Came again, a dragging noise, followed by a faint tap.
Top. Top.
Pause.
Top.
It came from the direction of the bluff, maybe 30 feet away. I stayed still, listening. I didn't want to unzip the tent and make noise unless I had to. Could be a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon, maybe even an owl dropping something. But I knew better. I grew up in the woods. I knew the sounds of animals. This wasn't that. I reached for the Glock under my sleeping bag. Just holding it made me feel steadier. But I still didn't move. The sounds stopped after a few minutes. Everything went quiet again. Too quiet. No bugs, no wind, nothing. I waited maybe another hour, maybe more. Then I finally dozed off again, gun still resting on my chest. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked around the camp. Nothing was disturbed. No prints, no trash, no sign that anything had been through. The fire pit was the same, untouched. The bluff edge looked normal, if a bit crumbly. I walked to the spot where I thought the sound had come from, just a few yards from the edge, and noticed something weird. A chunk of bark had been scraped off a nearby tree about knee height. It was fresh, pale beneath the torn layer. I ran my fingers across it. It wasn't from a deer rubbing antlers. The marks were too low, too sharp. Looked more like scratches, like someone had dragged something metal along the bark. I didn't like it. Still, I chalked it up to maybe some local hunter being nosy or messing around. Maybe a night fisher. The bluff overlooked a lot of water. Easy enough for someone to walk along the banks and come up, if they knew where to look. I should have packed up. I should have left. But I didn't. Instead, I spent the day hiking upriver, exploring some old rock outcrops and a half-sunken canoe that had probably been rotting there for decades. I was gone for maybe 4 or 5 hours. When I got back to camp, nothing seemed out of place. Fire pit still cold, tent zipped, cooler untouched. But something felt wrong. Took me until dusk to figure it out. It was the smell. Faint at first, like something sour mixed with rust. I thought maybe something died in the brush nearby, but I couldn't find anything. The wind didn't help. It kept shifting, sometimes stronger, sometimes gone. That night, I kept the fire going until well past 2 a.m. I didn't want to go back in the tent. I sat in my camp chair with the gun resting on my lap, eyes scanning the dark tree line around me. I never saw anything move, but I heard things. Footsteps, pauses, breathing. Twice I thought I caught the reflection of eyes behind the trees, low to the ground. But when I blinked, it was gone. Could have been an animal. Could have been nothing. Just before 3 a.m., I finally crawled into the tent, too tired to stay up. I slept in short bursts, every small sound jolting me awake again. The third morning was when I found the tracks. I was gathering kindling when I saw them, just off to the side of the tent, partly hidden in the grass. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled the tent once, then stopped by the fire pit. I crouched down to look closer. The heel marks were deep. Whoever made them was heavy.
No xutred, no sacs.
Just skin against soil. I stood there, heart thudding. I hadn't made those. They weren't there yesterday. Someone had been here, watching.
I packet fast.
Threw the cooler into the truck bed, collapsed the tent without rolling it up, stuffed everything in bags. I didn't even bother brushing the dirt off my boots. Just got in, turned the key, and started back down the gravel path. But I didn't make it far. About a mile down the trail, my front tire hit something sharp and jolted hard. The truck listed left. I stopped and climbed out to look. Front driver's side tire was flat. A long gash ran down the rubber, fresh and wide. It wasn't a blowout. Someone had cut it. My stomach twisted. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The woods were silent. I checked the spare in the back. Still there. I worked fast, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Sweat ran down my back despite the cool morning air. I kept the gun on the tailgate while I jacked up the truck. Every creak of the metal sounded like a scream in the silence. It took 20 minutes, but I got the spare on and took off without rechecking anything. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. No cars passed me, no one else in sight. I made it back to Kansas City just after dark, heart still hammering even on the interstate. The next day, I called a friend of mine who used to do land surveys up north. Asked him if he knew anything about that bluff near the river. He paused, then said the place used to be called Deadwater Bluff. Wasn't on maps anymore. Old logging territory. No one lived out there now. Hadn't for decades. Apparently, a few folks had gone missing around there back in the late 90s. Mostly drifters, some campers. No official cases. Just rumors and faded flyers. That was the last time I camped alone. I never figured out who was out there with me. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe someone who didn't want to be seen. Maybe worse. What stuck with me wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't. The care they took not to leave signs. The way they circled without a sound. The method behind every move. That kind of quiet means practice. That kind of quiet means they've done it before. And maybe they weren't done yet. It was late October 2021 when I finally packed up the gear and left. Just tossed it all in the back of my truck and drove off before I could talk myself out of it. I had spent most of the year doing nothing but working and trying to survive the weight that came down on me after Lauren died. We hadn't spoken in over 2 years before it happened. A car accident on I-84 outside Boise. Fog, slick roads, a semi, and that was it. I didn't even find out until her sister called me 2 days later. I wasn't listed as next of kin. Why would I be? Still, it broke something in me when I heard. I couldn't focus at work. I stopped answering calls from friends. I stayed inside more and more. I had no right to grieve like I was, but I still did. And the more it went on, the more I needed to get out. I had to break the cycle, do something drastic, reset my brain. That's how I justified it to myself. Anyway, I chose a place up in northeastern Oregon, past La Grande and somewhere near Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. I didn't pick a campsite with reservations or running water. I wasn't looking for picnic tables or a fire ring. I wanted a place far from people. I figured if I couldn't handle a few days alone in the woods, maybe I didn't deserve to keep pretending I was doing fine. That's what grief does. It poisons how you see yourself, makes you think you need to punish yourself to make things right. Took me nearly 8 hours to drive out there from Vancouver. I crossed over into Oregon and then kept pushing east. The trees changed as I went. Fir and pine turned to larch and spruce, thick and wet with the October rain that had been falling on and off all week. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw. Just long stretches of narrow road, power lines dipping and rising like waves, and clouds sitting low over the mountains. I turned off onto a Forest Service road sometime in the late afternoon. No signs, just a mile marker and a tire rut that cut through a thick line of trees. I followed it for another hour, slow going with the mud and the sharp turns. A few times I had to get out and move down branches, but I liked it. It was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. When I finally found a place to set up, it was near a narrow stream and a small clearing surrounded by tall, leaning pines. There were no footprints, no tire tracks. It didn't look like anyone had been out there in years. The air had that smell of cold moss and rotting wood. I shut off the truck, got out, and listened. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I was alone finally. I set up camp quickly. Just my tent, a tarp between 2 trees, and a small stack of wood I'd brought. I didn't bother with a fire that first night. I was too tired and too distracted. I ate a cold sandwich, drank some water, and crawled into my sleeping bag as soon as the sun dipped behind the hills. It wasn't until I turned off my headlamp that I really noticed the silence. It was total. No cars, no airplanes overhead, no dogs, no human noise at all. Not even bugs chirping, just the wind, and even that had settled into stillness. It was a strange kind of quiet that made your ears strain for something, anything. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but it started to get to me. Every creak of a tree or snap of a twig outside my tent felt too sharp, too isolated. I slept in short bursts that night, waking up to nothing again and again. The next morning, I made coffee on my little camp stove and stood watching the sun break through the fog. I was deep in the woods, You could feel it in the cold, damp air, the way the trees hung heavy over everything. I tried to shake the feeling I had from the night before. It was just nerves, I told myself. I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. That's all. I hiked that day, trying to wear myself out and get used to the quiet. I didn't see anyone. No other campsites, no animals bigger than a squirrel. I saw some old logging road at one point, but it was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I followed a game trail for a while and then looped back. I made it back to camp just before dusk. That night, I lit a fire and sat watching it. I kept thinking about Lauren, about the last time we went camping together in Northern California before everything fell apart. I remembered her sitting on a log, humming quietly, wrapped in a big gray hoodie. I remembered how her face changed when she was relaxed, how the lines smoothed out. It made something tighten in my chest. I almost wished I had brought something of hers out there, even if we hadn't spoken in years. I felt like I owed her that much, but I didn't have anything. That second night, I was more alert. I kept my knife closer, even though I wasn't really sure what I thought was going to happen. I zipped the tent tighter, double-checked the flap, and made sure everything around camp was cleaned up. But I still woke up again and again to that same silence. Only now there were footsteps. They weren't loud, just soft crunches of leaves and twigs outside the tent, slow and spaced out like someone was trying not to make noise. I froze the first time I heard them. I lay there staring at the nylon wall of my tent, heart pounding in my ears. I reached out slowly, found the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam lit up the inside of the tent, but I didn't move for a long time. The footsteps stopped. After maybe 10 minutes, I unzipped the tent and looked out. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Everything was still. I stepped out barefoot, swept the light around the trees, the clearing, the path to the stream. Nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting the light. Just empty woods. I told myself it could have been a deer or an elk. There were no signs of anyone else, no reason to panic. I went back inside and tried to sleep, but I didn't get much. The next day, I thought about packing up and leaving. I kept asking myself if this whole trip was just some emotional mistake I had made out of guilt. But I didn't want to give up so quickly. I made a plan to stay one more night. I'd keep the fire going longer, stay alert, and if anything else happened, I'd leave in the morning. That afternoon, I explored further down the stream. I followed it until it narrowed into a rocky bed, then climbed a hill that overlooked the valley I was camped in. The view was beautiful, trees stretching endlessly, snow dusting the distant ridgelines, fog clinging to the lower parts like a sheet. On the way back, I found something that stopped me cold. A tarp, blue, faded. It was maybe a few hundred feet from my site, half covered in pine needles and moss. It had been there a long time, but it hadn't decomposed completely. I bent down and lifted one edge. Underneath were torn strips of duct tape and what looked like an old, rotted backpack. The frame had rusted. There was nothing else I could identify. No ID, no name. I left it untouched and walked straight back to camp. I felt sick the whole time, like something was behind me, just out of view. I kept hearing rustling in the trees, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just losing my nerve. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't even light the fire. I kept my flashlight on and my knife close. I stayed inside the tent, listening. The wind picked up, and the trees started to groan and creak. I waited for the footsteps, for that soft crunch of leaves again, and around 1 a.m. they came. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of camp. They came closer. I heard the unmistakable sound of a boot sliding in mud, the kind of sound that only happens when someone shifts their weight while standing still. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the knife handle. I didn't move. Something was standing just outside my tent. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed still, barely breathing. After maybe a full minute, I heard the footsteps again, this time walking away. I counted to 300 before I unzipped the flap and looked outside. Nothing, just trees, just night. But in the mud near the tent, I saw it. A boot print, human, deep, not mine. I left at sunrise.
No breakfast. No coffee.
I packed in 20 minutes, threw everything in the truck, and didn't even check if I forgot anything. I just drove. My tires slipped in the mud as I pushed back through the forest road, branches scraping the sides of the truck like claws. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never reported it. I never went back. I didn't look up missing persons cases. I didn't want to know. What I took from that trip wasn't clarity or healing. It was a reminder. Sometimes the silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's watching. And sometimes the past you think you're running from isn't the thing you need to fear. My name's Eric Bauer. I was 34 when this happened. It was 2022, and I just started my second year as a biology research assistant at a small but well-funded medical lab in Eugene, Oregon. I'd worked hard to land that job, especially since most people in my field either ended up stuck in classrooms or pushing paper in sterile offices. I didn't want that. I liked field work. I liked being out in real nature, getting dirty, digging under rocks, and watching how things actually lived and died out there. The project I was on focused on a parasitic beetle found only in specific old-growth areas of the Pacific Northwest. It's a tiny black thing, not much longer than a grain of rice, but it carried enzymes in its gut that helped break down a particular bacterial strain we were studying for antibiotic resistance. Don't ask me how someone discovered that. Science is weird. All I knew was the lab needed more live samples, and no one else wanted to spend days in the middle of nowhere with a headlamp, digging through rot and dung piles. I volunteered. I wanted the credit. I wanted the data. That's how I ended up hauling a 40-pound pack into a remote stretch of forest near the Santiam River. It wasn't a national park. It wasn't even officially a campground. It was raw public land, and I'd gotten the green light after filing the permits. No tourists, no noise, just thick forest, muddy trails, and scattered wildlife. Perfect for collecting rare bugs in peace. I parked the truck at a trailhead off a service road about 90 minutes from Mill City. There was no cell signal from the moment I left the highway, just a line of pine trees leaning in like they were whispering about me. The air was cool and damp. It had rained the day before, and the earth squished under my boots as I stepped out. I loaded up, locked the truck, double-checked the coordinates I'd planned, and started walking. I hiked for nearly 5 hours that first day, deep into the hills, following faint deer trails and using landmarks I'd marked out from satellite images. A fallen pine snapped at its base, a forked rock near a mossy ravine, a large outcrop shaped like a sideways tooth. These weren't on any map. This was pure backcountry. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing next to a muddy creek that trickled down from the northern slopes. There were signs of elk in the area, hoof prints, droppings, a few antler rubs on the bark, but I wasn't worried. I had bear spray, a flare, and my camping rifle just in case. The plan was simple: 3 nights, 2 full days of collection, and back to civilization by the 4th morning. I set up my tent, filtered some water, ate a cold meal, and went to bed early. The first night was uneventful. I woke up to the sound of birds and a squirrel chittering somewhere above me. The air was crisp and the sky had a watery blue color that made everything feel fresh. I stretched, checked my gear, and grabbed my collection kit. By noon, I had 3 vials of live beetles and 2 more filled with other samples, larvae, mites, a few centipedes. The area was rich with decaying wood, perfect for what I needed. I was feeling good, maybe too good. That's when I found the trail. It wasn't a man-made one, at least not obviously. just a narrow stretch of flattened vegetation leading away from the creek, winding between dense clusters of alder and spruce. I thought maybe it was from elk or deer, but something about it felt off. Too narrow for elk, too erratic for deer. It didn't follow a consistent direction. It weaved, zigzagging between trees like whatever made it couldn't walk straight. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I followed it for maybe 20 minutes, and that's when I saw the hole. It was about 4 feet wide, almost circular, dug into the hillside with clawed-out earth scattered around its edge. Not just a dent in the ground, this was deep, deeper than any animal burrow I'd seen in that area. And it smelled, not like rot or death, but like something ancient. Damp soil, mold, and an oily stink I couldn't place. Not sulfur, not feces, just wrong. I knelt beside it, shining my flashlight into the dark. The beam barely reached the bottom, maybe 10 feet down. The sides were packed dirt and roots, and I thought I saw something move near the bottom, just a twitch like a bug or rodent. I didn't climb down. I marked the GPS coordinates and made a note to return the next day. Maybe the beetles were nesting there. Maybe this was a jackpot. I headed back to camp, loaded up the samples, and spent the rest of the afternoon logging data and prepping fresh files. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the hole kept flashing in my mind. I'd seen strange burrows before. Fox dens, collapsed sinkholes, even abandoned mine shafts. But this wasn't any of those. This looked like something had dug it with purpose. Not for shelter, not to hide, just to be there. Around 2 a.m., I heard rustling outside my tent. Loud, heavy. I sat up, heart thudding, hand on my rifle. The sound moved past the tent, slow and steady, then stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My ears strained in the silence. Nothing. Then a wet crunch, like something chewing. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, rifle on my lap, ears straining. When the light finally came, I stepped outside, slowly. The ground near the tent was churned up. Mud, leaves, and what looked like deep impressions. Not human, not boots, like knees or elbows had pressed into the earth. Drag marks led away toward the creek. I didn't follow them. Instead, I packed up the samples, grabbed my gear, and made for the burrow. I needed to finish what I came for, get the data, and leave. When I got back to the hole, it had changed. It was deeper, at least another 4 feet down. The edges had collapsed inward in places, like something had gone in or out during the night. I leaned over, flashlight in hand, and again I saw movement. Not one thing, many. Hundreds of tiny bodies shifting just out of reach. Beetles, maybe, but not like the ones I'd seen. These were longer, thinner, with glints of red and green under their shells. They scattered when the light hit them, vanishing into the darkness like water down a drain. I wanted a sample. I wanted proof. So I tied a rope to a nearby stump, clipped it to my belt, and lowered myself in. The dirt was damp and crumbly. My boots scraped against roots. I went down slowly, 1 foot at a time, until I hit the bottom. The air down there was warmer than I expected. Thick, almost hard to breathe. I felt the ground shift slightly under my weight. My light flicked across the dirt walls, and that's when I saw them. Not just insects, bones, tiny ones, dozens, hundreds, scattered like debris around the bottom. Rodent skulls, bird wings, some broken, some whole, all stripped clean. The bugs had done it. I knew it right away. These things weren't just scavengers, they were predators. Organized, maybe even territorial. And they weren't the same beetles I was studying. This was something else, uncatalogued. I collected 2 vials worth and got the hell out of that hole. I didn't sleep the next night either. I sat in the tent, lights off, rifle ready, ears open. And just like before, something came back. But this time it didn't stop. It brushed against the tent. A soft sound, like fingers dragging across nylon. Then a weight pressed against the wall behind me. Not heavy, but firm. Testing. Then nothing. By sunrise, I made my decision. No more samples. No more burrow. I packed up everything. I was going home, but the forest didn't want me to leave. The trail was wrong. The landmarks I'd memorized were missing or moved. The forked rock? Gone. The snapped pine? Just a fallen log. The deer trail I'd used? Overgrown. I wasn't lost. I still had GPS, but the forest didn't look the same anymore. Like it had shifted. I pushed through brush for hours, soaking wet from sweat and creek water, until I finally found the old service road again. When I reached the truck, it was covered in mud. Not just splashed, smeared. Handprints. Dozens of them. Small. Thin. With clawed fingers. I didn't stop. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. When I got back to the lab, I handed off the samples. The techs were excited. Said they'd never seen anything like the new beetles I'd found. Said I might have discovered a new species. But I didn't care. I never went back. I quit a month later. Took a job teaching biology at a community college. Indoors. Safe. The last I heard, the lab had isolated enzymes from the new beetles that might be used in targeting resistant infections. Promising stuff. Maybe even groundbreaking. I still think about the hole, though. I think about the night something brushed against my tent. And I wonder how deep that hole really went. Because when I got home and cleaned out my gear, I found a clump of damp soil in my boot. Inside it was a beetle, still alive, but not alone. There were eggs too. I burned the boot. I was 32 the year I decided to go camping alone for a few days in late October. I'd been doing solo trips off and on since I was about 25, and I thought I had a decent handle on what I was doing. I never went far from a trail system, always packed enough food, gear, and first aid, and made sure someone back home knew where I was. It was usually a peaceful escape from the noise of everything back in town. This time, I chose a spot near Lake Mille Lacs in Minnesota. I used to fish there with my dad as a kid, and I remembered the surrounding forests being quiet and mostly empty outside of summer. By late October, most of the tourists were long gone. The air was already colder, and nights dipped below freezing sometimes, which meant even fewer people around. Sounded perfect. I parked at a small gravel turnout that wasn't anything official, just a spot I'd found on satellite maps. It was a mile or so from a dirt service road that branched off the main highway. Once I left my car and got deeper into the woods, I didn't see or hear another person. I set up camp about 2 miles in, near a wide clearing with a small stream running along the edge. There was no marked trail there, just signs of deer and some old boot prints near the water that looked weeks old. I pitched my small green tent between 2 thick pines, set up a little ring of stones for my fire, and started gathering wood. The air was crisp, the smell of leaves and dirt thick in my nose. Everything about it felt calm. The first day went like most trips. I gathered more firewood, cooked a basic meal, and sat by the flames until the cold pushed me into my sleeping bag. It got dark fast. Pitch black by 6:30 p.m., and by 8, I was already zipped inside the tent trying to get comfortable. The wind picked up sometime in the middle of the night, and I kept waking to small cracking noises in the trees, but nothing that felt threatening. It was just nature doing what it does. The second day, I explored a little more up along the stream. I walked for a few hours with my day pack, following the bend of the water until I hit a thick patch of brush that was too tangled to push through. I sat and ate lunch on a flat rock while watching the water ripple past. I hadn't seen a soul. No campers, no hikers, not even a plane overhead. It was one of those rare moments where you forget that civilization exists. But when I got back to my site, something felt off. Nothing was missing. Nothing moved. The tent was untouched. But the pile of wood I'd stacked had shifted. Not fallen, shifted. As if someone had picked through it and placed some pieces back in a slightly different shape. I stared at it for a long time. I even crouched down and checked the ground around it, looking for tracks. There were faint disturbances, but the ground was soft in places from rain a few days earlier, and I couldn't be sure if it was mine from earlier that morning or someone else's. I sat by the fire ring and told myself maybe an animal had nudged it, maybe a raccoon or something. I tried to shake the feeling, but the thought stuck to me like a burr in my sock. I stayed close to the site for the rest of the day and listened more than I usually do. Every crack of a twig or rustle of brush had my eyes darting in its direction. But again, nothing came out of the woods, just trees and wind and the occasional bird. That night, I stayed up later, even after the fire died. I didn't want to go inside the tent. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but that quiet, gnawing voice in the back of my head kept whispering that something was wrong. I finally crawled into my bag around midnight, dead tired but still listening to every sound outside the thin fabric walls of my tent. At some point during the night, I think around 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up again. It wasn't a noise that did it this time. It was the absence of it. The wind had stopped completely, and the forest was just still. No leaves, no creaking trees, just dead silence. I lay there, eyes open, heart thumping, waiting to hear something, anything. Then I did. A single crunch, maybe 15 feet away, heavy, not like a rabbit or a deer. Then another, deliberate, human. I stopped breathing for a moment, straining to hear more. Nothing. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my exact position. My heart was thudding now, so loud I thought it might be echoing in the woods. Then, after maybe 10 minutes of silence, I heard it again. One more crunch, closer. It felt like whoever or whatever it was had just moved a few steps and stopped. That's when I reached for the knife I kept inside the tent pocket. Not that it would have done much, but it made me feel less helpless. I sat frozen in my bag for at least an hour, not daring to make a sound. I never heard footsteps retreat, just nothing. When the sun finally started to lighten the sky, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, and what I saw chilled me more than the cold air. There were boot prints, not mine, bigger, maybe a size 12 or 13. The heel patterns were different too. They started near the edge of the trees and circled the tent in a wide arc, then stopped. No prints led away. I scanned every inch of the clearing and found nothing else. No signs of camping gear, no food wrappers, no broken branches. Whoever had been there was just watching, quiet, careful. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even pack properly. I shoved everything into my pack, stomped out the fire pit, and started walking back toward the car. I moved fast, but quiet. I didn't want to run and make noise, but I didn't stop to rest either. About halfway back to the car, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A whistle. 3 sharp notes, far off, echoing through the woods. Then silence again. I kept moving, heart pounding. I didn't turn back, didn't look for the source. I just wanted to get the hell out. When I reached the gravel turnout where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief died quickly. There were fresh tire tracks next to mine. Deep ones. A larger vehicle. Maybe a pickup or SUV. And next to the tracks, more boot prints. Same size as before. Leading toward the woods. Then looping back. I unlocked my car, threw everything in, and got in with shaking hands. The engine started fine, but I was sweating through my jacket. I drove back to the highway and didn't stop until I was 30 miles out, pulled into a gas station, and sat in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about calling the cops, telling them someone had followed me out there. Stalked me, maybe, but what could I even say? I had no name, no face, no proof of anything. Just tracks in the dirt and a feeling I still can't fully explain. I never went back to that part of the forest. I haven't gone solo camping since. Sometimes I wonder who it was. A hunter? A squatter? Someone who saw my car parked alone on a back road and decided to mess with me? Or maybe they weren't trying to mess with me at all. Maybe they were just waiting for me to fall asleep. All I know is that if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd have made it out. It was mid-September 2018 when I went camping alone in the thick pine forests of northern Idaho. I was 33 then. I had taken some time off work, needing to get away from people, traffic, phones, and that constant noise that crawls under your skin after months in a city. I lived in Boise back then, and I'd done a few solo camping trips before, mostly weekend things around Lake Cascade or in the Sawtooths. But this one was a bit further out, deeper into forested land where not a lot of people went. I wasn't completely new to the woods, but I wouldn't call myself some mountain man either. Just enough experience to know how to pitch a tent, keep food stored right, and not be dumb about weather or animals. I chose a spot not too far from Priest Lake, but not in the actual campground. I parked my truck along an old Forest Service road that barely looked used anymore and hiked in about 3 miles, hauling my gear in one of those internal frame packs I used when I used to go backpacking with my brother a few years earlier. The place I found wasn't a clearing exactly. It was a flatter section under tall pines, thick with needles on the ground, and with a small slope that led down to a creek. The trees were packed close, but there was just enough space to set up a one-man tent. I had my small cook stove, a bear canister, a good rain fly, and a headlamp with backup batteries. I felt prepared. It was quiet out there, which was exactly what I wanted. I didn't see any other hikers or campers on the way in, not even tire tracks near where I parked. I set up camp, gathered a bit of dry wood just in case I wanted a small fire that evening, though I wasn't planning to make a big one, and cooked some canned chili over my little stove. I ate early, cleaned everything, packed it up, and sat on a flat rock near the creek, just listening to the forest. I remember noticing how still everything was. No wind, not even birds that I could hear. That kind of deep silence where even your heartbeat sounds too loud. I sat there a long time trying to just let go of all the stuff I'd brought with me in my head. Work stress, bills, people who drained me. Eventually, the clouds started pushing in. Big, thick, low ones. The kind that hang heavy like wet wool. I checked the barometer on my watch. Pressure was dropping fast. I knew rain was coming. I checked the forecast before I left, and it said there might be some overnight showers, but it was looking more serious than that now. By the time I zipped up the tent for the night, it was already starting to spit rain. Just a mist at first, like someone flicking water from their fingers, but it picked up quick. The wind came in short bursts, shaking the tops of the trees, and the rain started falling heavier. I adjusted the rainfly, double-checked the guy lines, and crawled inside with my pack. The tent was one of those low-profile ones that sit close to the ground. Good for wind resistance, not great for stretching your legs. I had my sleeping bag rolled out, dry socks on, and my headlamp hanging from the little loop at the top of the tent. I laid there for maybe an hour, listening to the rain get louder, turning from a steady tap to a full-on downpour. The kind of rain that soaks through your jacket in minutes. The kind that makes the ground soft and turns trails into mud rivers. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I didn't hear anything at first, just the pounding of rain on the tent. Then I realized the ground under my left hip felt different.
Wet.
I turned on my headlamp and checked. Sure enough, water was starting to seep in along the seam where the tent floor met the wall. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt it. a cold trickle, barely visible but definitely coming in. I sat up and checked all the corners. One of the tent stakes had come loose in the softening ground, and water was pooling near that side. I threw on my jacket and boots and went outside to resecure the lines. The rain hit me like cold needles. I drove the stake in deeper, adjusted the angle, and did the same with the others. My fingers went numb fast, but I got it done. Back inside, I used one of my spare shirts to blot the damp spot, laid down, and tried to get back to sleep. The rain didn't let up. In fact, it got worse. Thunder started rolling in from the west, long, deep rumbles that sounded like they came from underground. The flashes of lightning lit the whole tent up for a second or two at a time. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not rain, something else. It was faint at first, almost masked by the storm, but I caught it, something snapping, like a branch, not a small twig, a solid, dry branch cracking under weight. Not wind, too deliberate, too sharp. I froze. Came again. A second crack. Closer. Then another, muffled in the rain. I reached for the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag. A fixed blade I used for food, rope, whatever. I didn't know why I was holding it. Instinct, I guess. I turned off my headlamp. Sat still. Nothing. The rain kept hammering down. My breathing felt loud. Then I heard it, footsteps. Real, heavy, human footsteps. Not an animal. They stopped near my tent. I sat completely still, knife in hand, ears straining. A full minute passed. Then, I heard movement again, just a few feet from me. Whatever it was didn't speak, didn't call out. It just stood there. I imagined someone out there, soaked head to toe, standing motionless in the dark, listening to me breathe. Then the sound of something being dragged across the ground. Slow. A scrape, followed by another. Not close enough to touch the tent. Just near. I stayed frozen, every muscle tight. Eventually, I didn't hear anything. No more dragging. No more steps. Just rain. I waited what must have been another 20 minutes before I moved. I didn't unzip the tent. I just stayed alert, knife in hand, listening to the storm. At some point, I drifted off again from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was light. The rain had stopped. Everything was soaked, but the storm had passed. I opened the tent and looked around. Wet trees, mud, pine needles. Then I saw the footprints. Real ones, human boots. They came from deeper in the woods, stopped near my tent, then circled to the side and went back the way they came. Not mine. I checked my own prints from when I fixed the tent. Completely different tread pattern. And about 15 feet away, there were drag marks. A long groove in the mud, like someone had pulled something heavy through it. Maybe a log, maybe not. I followed it with my eyes until it faded into the woods. I didn't stick around. I packed my gear in 10 minutes flat, didn't eat, didn't care about the wet tent, just stuffed everything into the pack and headed straight back toward the truck. I checked over my shoulder every 100 feet. The trail was slick, my boots kept slipping, but I didn't stop until I saw the old service road again. When I got to the truck, I saw more boot prints in the mud, different ones. They led from the forest to the back of my truck and then disappeared again toward the trees. Someone had come out there, in the middle of a storm, found my truck, then found my tent. I didn't report it. There wasn't anything to report. No crime, no injuries, just a terrifying experience that sat in the back of my head like a brick. I never went back to that part of Idaho. I still camp sometimes, but not alone anymore, and never far from other people. And every time it rains, I think about that night, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off and spend a couple weeks alone camping across parts of southern France. It was the spring of 2017. I'd been working a non-stop grind back in Amsterdam, rarely taking a real break. I didn't tell many people about the trip, just packed up my gear, booked a one-way train to Marseille, and started making my way inland toward quieter areas. I had a plan to move through some less popular trails and sleep out in my tent where I could, maybe hit a few rural campsites when I needed to restock. After a few nights around Digny-les-Bains and Castellane, I found myself drawn to the more wooded parts east of a small village called Anat. I'd passed through it by foot, barely saw anyone, just a handful of farmers and a few old stone buildings in the valley. The farther I moved into the forest beyond it, the more I felt that kind of quiet that makes your ears ring a little. No wind, no animals, just that muffled kind of stillness you don't hear until you're really deep out there. It was the fourth night in the area when things got strange. I'd followed a barely visible trail into a dense forest area. Tall beech and pine trees, huge moss-covered stones that looked like they hadn't been moved since before anyone wrote anything down. The trees made it darker than it should have been that afternoon, and everything felt heavy with moisture, even though it hadn't rained. I set up my tent near a big flat stone about 10 meters across. It looked like it had once been a gathering place, or maybe even some old structure. I didn't think too much about it. Just cleared some brush, laid out the ground sheet, and got my small fire going before sunset. I cooked some rice and canned lentils, ate slow, then read by flashlight for a bit. There was no signal that deep in the trees. No GPS, no calls, no messages. I liked it that way. That's what I wanted, really, to be off the grid. But that night, I remember not finishing the page I was on. I couldn't focus. Something felt off. It wasn't just the quiet. It was too quiet. I hadn't seen a single hiker or person in 2 days, and I hadn't even heard birds or bugs that evening. The firewood I gathered had felt a little damp even though it hadn't rained. It gave off more smoke than heat. The smell of wet bark stuck to my clothes. At some point, I just gave up reading, killed the light, zipped up the tent, and lay still. I wasn't tired, just didn't feel like being awake anymore. There was nothing to do, and I figured sleep would come eventually. It must have been after midnight when I first heard the sound. It was faint but sharp enough to be out of place, like a heel scuffing over stone. It wasn't an animal. It was too clean, too mechanical. Just once, then nothing. I sat up and waited. It's hard to explain how long a minute feels when you're in the dark woods, alone, with no way to know what's moving outside. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I just stayed frozen. Then I heard it again, this time longer, a soft dragging, like someone was walking slowly across the flat stone outside. That smooth scrape of something sliding, like boots or shoes. I wasn't imagining it. I heard it again, this time a sharper tap, like the tip of something hard tapping rock. I don't know how long I sat there, holding my breath, but the sounds eventually stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just stayed completely still, clutching the camping knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. I didn't turn on my light. I didn't move. I just waited for morning. When light finally started to fill the tent, I unzipped it and peeked out. Everything looked the same. The big stone was covered in a light mist. There were no obvious footprints, just a few indentations near the edge of the stone, like spots where moss had been disturbed. I figured it could have been deer or something, maybe a wild boar, maybe a tree limb fell and dragged a branch. I wasn't thinking clearly. I convinced myself to brush it off. I packed up early and moved on. I wanted to get at least 10 kilometers in before stopping again. I hiked all day, deeper into the forest, taking side paths, just trying to put distance between me and whatever that had been. I didn't see anyone, not a soul. By late afternoon, I found another place to camp. There was a narrow stream nearby, and the trees were a little more spaced out. I set up under a rise where the land sloped slightly, giving me some shelter from wind and a view of the ridge above. I remember telling myself this would be better. More open, more visibility, safer in some strange way. That night, I didn't start a fire. I ate cold food from a tin and stayed inside the tent with my light off, just listening. I didn't hear anything for hours. I finally dozed off sometime after 1 a.m. I woke up to the sound of crunching. It wasn't close, maybe 30 meters up the hill, but I heard it clear. Crunching leaves. Someone walking. It wasn't heavy, not like boots. It was slow, uneven. I kept still, heart pounding, trying to breathe through my nose so I wouldn't make noise. The sound kept going, step, pause, step, then another pause. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, but I felt like whatever it was had stopped. Then I heard breathing. Not loud, not panting, just soft and slow. Not mine. It was like someone was standing just out of sight, watching. I reached for my flashlight and knife, but didn't turn the light on. I stayed that way, frozen again, until the breathing stopped. When it did, I heard nothing for almost an hour. Then eventually, maybe near dawn, I heard the softest sound of movement retreating up the hill. Fainter, fainter, then gone. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I looked around. I didn't find tracks. The ground was covered in pine needles and broken leaves, soft enough that nothing left a clear print. But I knew what I heard. I moved again, farther east, toward a dry ridge that overlooked a long wooded valley. I followed an old firebreak trail until I found an area I could climb down into and disappear from any view above. I thought maybe I'd be harder to follow that way. I wasn't even sure if I was being followed. I still kept telling myself I was being paranoid. That night, I made a mistake. I lit a fire again. I was exhausted, and the cold was settling deep into my bones. I hadn't eaten properly in a day and a half. I needed warmth. I used only dry pine and kept the fire small, just enough to cook and feel human again. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag outside the tent, near the fire, and tried to relax. The ridge behind me rose sharply, and the trees blocked most of the view above. Felt like the safest spot so far. But around midnight, I looked up and saw something at the edge of the firelight. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still at the base of one of the trees, half in shadow, half in light. She had long dark hair that hung flat, parted unevenly. Her clothes didn't fit the surroundings. A long black skirt, heavy, almost like wool, and a jacket that looked out of place, like something you'd see in a photo from the 1950s. She wasn't barefoot, but I couldn't see her shoes clearly. Her hands were stiff by her sides. She didn't say anything, didn't move. I stared, not blinking, barely breathing. I didn't reach for my knife. I didn't move. I didn't want to provoke anything. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe she was from a farm nearby. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she had mental issues. But none of those things explained why she was there at that hour, watching silently from the trees. I don't know how long we sat like that, me by the fire, her in the dark. Then she turned. Not fast, just slowly turned and walked back into the trees. Not a word, not a glance, just slipped away into the dark. I didn't sleep. I didn't even go inside the tent. I just kept the fire alive until sunrise. When morning came, I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I didn't even eat. I just moved. I pushed north toward the edge of the forest, toward any kind of civilization. After about 7 hours of hiking, I finally crossed a service road, followed it, and reached a farmhouse. I knocked, waited. An old man eventually came out and stared at me like I was a stranger from another planet. I told him I was a hiker who'd lost my bearings. He didn't say anything, but let me refill my bottle from a hose. I asked how far the nearest town was, and he pointed without a word. I followed the road until I reached a village called Braux. It was tiny, maybe 30 houses, No hotel, just a small post office and a bakery. I didn't stay long. I hitched a ride the next day with a local who was heading towards Sistron. From there, I took a bus back to Marseille. I never went back to those woods. I still think about the woman, not just what she looked like, but why she was there. I've read stories of hermits, of people who live off-grid, wanderers who've chosen isolation for their own reasons. Maybe she was one of them. Maybe she wasn't trying to scare me. Maybe she was just curious. But then I remember the sounds from earlier nights, soft, deliberate steps, breathing close to the tent. She'd been following me. She didn't want to be seen at first. Only later, when I lit the fire, did she make herself visible. That part always sticks with me. I never told anyone about it. Not really. Just said I had a bad trip, felt unsafe, cut it short. Nobody asks much when you say that. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost or anything from a story. It was a person, a real woman, someone who lived or wandered or waited in that forest. And for some reason, she chose to follow me. I took a solo trip in October of 2021, just before the weather really turned. I was 33 at the time. I had been going through a rough patch. Divorce finalized a few months earlier, and I was just trying to get back to myself. I wanted peace, silence, somewhere out of the way where no one could reach me for a while. That's why I picked a remote area just west of Raton, New Mexico. Sparse hills, dead grass, some scattered pinyon and juniper trees, and long dirt roads that twisted up into the backcountry where no one really went unless they had a reason. I loaded my gear into my old Tacoma and drove out of Albuquerque early in the morning. I had a cooler, plenty of water, dried food, a simple two-man tent, and my old .45 for safety. Not that I expected to need it. I also had my Garmin in reach, since I knew there'd be no cell service once I got out there. It was just a safety net, something I brought for peace of mind. The drive was about 3.5 hours, and I didn't see another car once I left the main road. The dirt trail I followed wasn't on any official map, but I had found it while poring over satellite imagery weeks earlier. It cut through the southern stretch of the Vermejo Park ranchlands, though I wasn't on any official property. I parked near a small ridge and hiked in another mile with my gear. The landscape was dry, dusty, and empty, beautiful in its own quiet way. That feeling of complete isolation was exactly what I needed. I pitched my tent near a dry creek bed and got camp set up. I had no schedule, no plans. I boiled water for coffee, sat on a folding stool, and just watched the wind bend the tall yellow grass. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. No cars.
No voices.
Not even a plane overhead. Just the wind and the occasional caw of a crow off somewhere in the brush. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, drank a bit of whiskey, and read for a while by headlamp before crawling into my sleeping bag. I woke a few times to the sound of coyotes far off, but nothing close. It was cold, probably in the mid-30s, but I was layered up and comfortable. The second day, I went exploring. I didn't go far, maybe a couple miles from camp, checking out the terrain. There wasn't much out there, just old broken fences, rusted cans, signs that someone had been here maybe decades ago. There were no trail markers, no footprints, no fresh tire tracks. I remember thinking that this place hadn't seen another person in a long, long time. But that night, something shifted. It started with small things, sounds I couldn't place. When I was lying in my tent, I swore I heard footsteps outside. Not coyotes, not deer. Human footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. I froze. My hand went straight to the pistol beside me. I lay there, holding my breath, ears straining. The steps circled my tent once, then nothing, just silence again. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I got out and checked the area,
No prints.
but the ground was hard-packed and dry, not ideal for leaving marks. I told myself it had to be an animal, probably a deer or even a stray cow from one of the nearby ranches. I tried to brush it off. I made coffee and ate a cold granola bar, but that feeling of calm was gone. The silence that had felt peaceful now felt wrong, heavy, like the hills were watching me. Later that day, I hiked a bit farther. I don't know why, but I didn't want to stay too close to camp. Maybe I was trying to shake off the nerves. I went up one of the ridges to get a better look at the area. From up there, I could see miles in every direction. Nothing but grass, low hills, and brush. But just as I was about to head back, I spotted something odd in a patch of trees about half a mile away. Something that didn't look natural. Square edges, white. It stood out against the dirt and sagebrush. I couldn't help myself. I headed straight for it. It was an old camper trailer, one of those single-axle types from the 70s or 80s. Faded white, streaked with rust, windows shattered. It looked like it hadn't been moved in years. The ground around it was overgrown. There were no tire tracks, no path leading to it. Just this thing sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. I walked around it slowly, keeping my distance. The door was slightly open. Something about it made my stomach knot up. I didn't go inside. Couldn't. There was a sour, metallic smell coming from the open door, and I didn't want to know what was inside. I turned and walked straight back to camp, faster than I realized. That night was worse. Just after midnight, I heard the steps again. Slower this time. I didn't move. I kept still, breathing shallow. Whoever or whatever, it was stopped right next to my tent. I heard a zipper move on one of my bags outside. I kept my hand on the pistol, but I didn't unzip the tent or say anything. I was frozen. After a long pause, the steps moved off into the darkness.
I stayed up till dawn.
When I finally got out, one of my bags had been opened. My backup flashlight was missing. Nothing else. Just that. I didn't understand it. Whoever had been there didn't try to get into the tent. Didn't take food or gear or even the Garmin. Just the flashlight. I packed up right then and there. But I didn't make it out. The road I had driven in on was blocked. A tree had been pushed down across the trail. Not fallen, pushed. You could see where it had been shoved from the base, clean and deliberate, like someone had used leverage or even a winch to knock it over. It wasn't wide, maybe 10 or 12 inches in diameter, but I couldn't drive over it. I didn't have the tools to cut it. I didn't want to leave the truck behind. I hiked back to camp and stayed one more night, planning to hike out on foot with the Garmin the next morning. I figured I could walk out to a ridge where the satellite might get better signal and call for help. But that night, things got worse. Just after dark, I heard movement. Not footsteps this time. Branches breaking. Brush being pushed through. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I sat by the fire, pistol in hand, flashlight in the other. I kept the fire going as high as I could. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat, staring into the dark, listening. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure at the edge of the trees, too far to make out clearly. But it wasn't an animal. I know what animals look like in the dark. This was a person, standing, watching. I didn't shoot. I didn't say a word. I just kept the gun pointed toward the figure until it disappeared back into the brush. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I left the tent behind, took my pack, Garmin, water, and started hiking fast, moving south toward where I knew the highway was, probably 8 or 9 miles out. I climbed a ridge and managed to get a message out on the inReach. It took almost 10 minutes for the signal to lock, but eventually, I got a ping back. A ranch hand working nearby responded and said he'd send someone out in a couple of hours. I stayed on that ridge until a beat-up ranch truck finally rolled up the trail. It was just one guy, mid-50s, said he worked for a private landowner nearby. He didn't ask questions, just helped me load my bag and drove me back to my truck. I didn't tell him what happened. I just thanked him. When I got back to where I'd left the Tacoma, the down tree was gone. Gone. Completely. Like it had never been there. I didn't check the trailer again. I didn't look around. I just got in the truck and drove, and I didn't stop until I hit the interstate. I never reported anything. What could I even say? There was no crime, no evidence, no names, just a creeping sense that someone, maybe more than one, lives out in those hills. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who watches. That trip was supposed to help me find peace. Instead, it taught me something different. Not all places are meant to be alone in. Some land feels empty for a reason, and I won't ever go back. It was late October of 2021, and I had just turned 29 a couple of weeks before. I lived in northern Georgia at the time, working remotely in software development, which gave me the kind of freedom I needed to take short solo camping trips whenever I wanted to clear my head. I wasn't really the adventurous type growing up, but over the years I'd developed a thing for being alone in nature. I think it helped me reset, especially when work or life got a little too loud. That weekend, I decided to head out to a place I hadn't been before. A remote stretch of land along the Alabama side of the Tallapoosa River. I'd heard about it from a guy I'd met on a hiking forum who'd posted photos of an old iron bridge deep in the woods. It wasn't on any map, not even the USGS topo layers. It looked abandoned and overgrown, and that made it even more appealing. Something about forgotten places pulled me in. I figured I'd drive out Friday morning, get there by midday, hike in a couple of miles, set up camp near the bridge, and just chill for a couple of days. The drive out there took just under 4 hours. I stopped at a gas station outside Wadley to stock up on some snacks and water. I already had my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, tarp, Jetboil stove, basic first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, knife, bear spray, extra clothes, the usual. I parked my car about half a mile off a dirt service road, just before the trail became too narrow to drive. There weren't any official trail markers, just an old, beat-up gate with a rusted chain hanging off to the side. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, high 60s, and that crisp fall smell that always makes the woods feel a little quieter. I walked for maybe 2.5 miles through mostly pine and hardwood. The path narrowed into a worn deer trail, and after another half hour, I finally found the bridge. It looked exactly like the photos, massive, rust-covered, with one side twisted and partially collapsed into the ravine below. There was no road on either end of it anymore, just gravel and weeds. Nature had slowly started reclaiming it. I figured it had been out of use for decades. There was a gentle slope down to the riverbank beside it, and just enough flat space to set up my small tent between a few sweet gums. I dropped my pack, got everything set up, and boiled water for some instant noodles. I remember sitting there with my back to a tree, just looking up through the branches as the light started to fade. That first night passed quietly. I slept light like I usually do out there. I'd hear the usual sounds: leaves shifting, a few small animals running through the underbrush, the occasional owl, but nothing out of place. Sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., I did hear something heavier moving around in the woods on the far side of the bridge, maybe 40 or 50 yards off. My first thought was deer, maybe even a boar, but the sounds didn't linger long, and I didn't hear them again after that. I sat still in my bag for a while, listening. It was dead quiet again after a few minutes. The bridge creaked in the wind once or twice, that long, drawn-out groan metal makes when it's strained. The next morning I got up early, stretched out my back, and walked the area a bit. The bridge itself was too unstable to walk across, but I took some photos and explored down by the water. There was something peaceful about the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, turning the river amber. I saw some raccoon tracks near the edge and found an old rusted hubcap half buried in the mud. I figured maybe a car had once gone over the bridge or gotten dumped out here decades ago. Around noon, I made lunch and sat on a large, flat rock not far from camp, just letting my feet soak in the cold water. I was fully relaxed. That changed sometime around 4 p.m. I was collecting deadfall a little deeper in the woods when I noticed something that didn't sit right. About 60 feet from my camp, in a shaded area between a stand of tulip poplars, I saw what looked like fresh tire tracks. They weren't obvious at first, just slight indentations in the soft earth, but they were too clean and straight to be made by anything natural. And they weren't old. The edges hadn't dried or crumbled. I crouched down and touched them. They were fresh, real fresh. It hadn't rained in over a week, and those marks looked like they'd been made within the past few hours. They weren't ATV tracks either, wider like a small truck or SUV. That caught me off guard because I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left my car, and I was miles off the road. I walked the length of the tracks back toward where I thought they might have come from, but they just sort of faded out near a ridge where the forest thickened. There were no roads on that side, no real clearings or signs of recent human activity. I turned around and followed them back, now feeling a bit uneasy. When I got back to camp, I checked my gear. Everything was still there, but I noticed that one of my food bags, the one with the trail mix and jerky, had been unzipped. I was almost sure I'd left it sealed in my pack, and even if an animal had gotten into it, there'd be tearing or chew marks. But the zipper was cleanly undone. Nothing was missing, though. That's what bothered me. Why unzip it just to leave it? That night, I barely slept. I laid there for hours, flashlight in hand, listening. Around midnight, I thought I heard branches snapping, sharp, single cracks, not the kind that come from falling limbs. It sounded like someone stepping on twigs, slow and deliberate, maybe 20 or 30 yards off. I didn't move, just breathed through my nose and kept my ears open. It stopped after a while, and eventually I drifted off out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to head out. I didn't feel right anymore. Something was off. I packed up quietly and tried to retrace my route back toward the car. I was maybe 3/4 of a mile from where I'd parked when I saw it. There was a small pull-off where the forest opened slightly, and there in the dirt were 2 clear boot prints, headed in the direction I'd just come from, toward the bridge. They were deep, crisp, fresh, size 10 or 11 maybe. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to make sense of how someone had followed me in without me ever hearing or seeing them. And that's when I noticed something else. Drag marks, faint, like someone had pulled something through the leaves. Not large enough for a deer or game, more like a small tarp or bag. The marks trailed off to the right, downhill toward a narrow ravine. Against my better judgment, I followed them maybe 30 yards. That's when I saw what looked like a small camouflage tent, hidden behind some brush, nearly invisible from the trail. It had no markings. There were no campfire remains, no backpack, nothing. Just a tent, zipped shut. I didn't touch it. I didn't call out. I turned around and walked back to my car, making sure I wasn't being followed. Every step felt like it took a full minute. My mouth was dry, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the leaves. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I felt a massive wave of relief. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back seat, and drove straight out of there, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I didn't report it. I didn't really know what to report. Strange tent and boot prints in the woods doesn't exactly get a priority response, especially not in rural Alabama. And I wasn't about to go back and poke around more. Whatever was going on out there, I wanted no part of it. I spent the next few days back home trying to push it out of my mind, but that uneasy feeling didn't go away. I kept thinking about the food bag, the zipped tent, the fact that someone was likely out there watching me the whole time. Not a ghost, not a monster, just some person with unknown intentions. And that's what makes it worse. It was late October 2013. I was 41. I'd been living in Glasgow for most of my life, but I was raised in a small town near Inverness, so I knew the Highlands well. Every year, once the leaves started turning red and gold, I'd take a trip back north and spend a few days hunting on my own. I didn't always need the meat, but I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet, the way the cold air stung your face first thing in the morning. It always made me feel alive. That year, I picked a spot I'd only been to once before. Back when I was younger, tagging along with my uncle and his friends. They called it Loch Scarich, though I don't even know if it had a proper name on the map. It was a rough area to get to, remote, with no marked trails and no signal. But I remembered the hills and thick pine cover and the way the mist hugged the lake in the morning like a secret. I drove up in my old Land Rover Defender, packed with all the usual gear: tent, rifle, thermal layers, stove, enough food to last 5 days, and a Garmin GPS just in case. I left my phone behind on purpose. I didn't want distractions. I parked about 2 hours from the loch and hiked the rest of the way in. It was steep, and by the time I reached the clearing by the lake, my legs were sore, and my lower back had started to complain. But the view was exactly how I remembered it. Calm, foggy, and silent except for the occasional ripple of water or distant rustle of trees. I set up camp near a boulder that broke up the shoreline. The weather was decent, cold, but dry, and I got a fire going before sunset. That first night, everything felt normal, peaceful even. I had a meal of instant noodles and tea, cleaned my rifle, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. The wind picked up a little through the night, but nothing too dramatic. The second day, I spotted a few tracks. Red deer, from the look of it. No fresh droppings, but the ground was soft, and the prints were recent. I followed them up through a small rise of fir trees and found a good spot to wait. I sat for hours, the way you do when you're hunting, motionless, breathing slow, watching shadows stretch and shrink as the sun shifts behind the clouds. I didn't see anything worth a shot, so I went back to camp by mid-afternoon, cooked a bit of canned stew, sat by the fire as the cold settled in, and tried to keep my fingers from getting too numb. That night was different. I woke up sometime after midnight because I thought I heard something outside the tent. Not animals moving through the brush, that's normal, but something slower, closer, like a footstep, then another. But when I unzipped the flap and looked out, there was nothing. Just darkness and the flicker of half-dead embers in the fire pit. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch falling, maybe my imagination getting ahead of itself. I went back to sleep. The third day, I found more tracks, but this time they didn't look right. Same size as before, but heavier, deeper, spread wider too, like whatever made them was moving fast, running. I crouched down and checked for prints layered over others. That's when I noticed something else. Beside the deer tracks, there were drag marks, not like someone pulling gear, like something heavy being dragged along the ground. I followed them for a while, but they veered off toward a rocky slope, and I didn't want to risk a fall, especially out there alone. I turned back and made it to camp just as it started to drizzle. That night, I didn't sleep much. The fire kept dying too quickly, and every time I started drifting off, I'd hear something. Not just one sound, but layers of them, snaps, light crunching, things moving in the trees. Once or twice I thought I saw a light flicker way off in the woods, but I couldn't be sure. There was no one else out there. No roads.
No cabins.
No other camps. The fourth day, I didn't go hunting. I stayed close to camp and gathered more wood, making sure the fire would burn longer. My nerves were starting to get frayed. I chalked it up to being alone too long, maybe getting paranoid, but part of me knew better. I camped solo dozens of times. I'd been in colder places, farther from help. But this time felt different. Not just in my head either. Something was off. I started noticing that some of the things around camp weren't quite where I left them. My backpack was zipped up when I was sure I left it open. One of the bungee cords on my tent flap was undone. My empty mug was on the other side of the fire pit. Little things, but they added up. Late in the afternoon, I was down by the edge of the lake, refilling my bottle, when I saw it. Across the water, maybe 80 yards out, half hidden in the trees, was a figure. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, just standing there, watching me. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood still. I blinked and looked again, and he was gone. I didn't go back down to the lake that evening. I kept the fire big, loaded up the stove, and pulled my gear closer to the tent. I cleaned my rifle again and laid it beside my sleeping bag. I didn't want to think the worst, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just on edge anymore. I was scared. The wind picked up again that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like a man breathing outside my tent. Not an animal, not wind, breathing, slow, heavy. I held still, my hand on the rifle, and listened. Then came a scraping sound, soft like a finger against nylon. Then silence. I waited until first light before unzipping the tent. Everything looked the same. Fire pit cold, trees still. But there, in the dirt around my camp, were footprints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet, human, white, deep. Whoever it was had been walking barefoot, and they'd stood just a few feet from where I slept. I packed my gear in record time. My plan was to hike back to the Defender and drive straight home. I didn't care if I didn't get a single shot off. I'd had enough. But I'd only made it about a mile when I saw something that made me stop cold. There was a makeshift camp tucked in the trees to the south. One I hadn't seen on the way in. It was primitive.
No tent.
Just a lean-to made of sticks and moss. The kind of thing you'd expect from someone who'd been out there a long time. I walked a little closer and found bones scattered nearby. Small ones. Animal, maybe, maybe not. The smell hit me next, rotten meat and old sweat. I didn't go any farther. I turned around and took a wider route, even though it meant losing my trail for a while. By the time I reached the Land Rover, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. I threw my gear in without organizing anything and started the engine. The road back down was rough, but I didn't stop. Didn't look in the rearview mirror once. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I'd say. No one had hurt me. I hadn't seen anything that counted as a crime. But I knew what I'd felt. I knew someone had been out there watching me. I knew they'd been close. I knew they wanted me to know. Back home, I tried to forget about it. For a while, I managed to. I threw myself into work, didn't talk about the trip. But little things kept creeping in. Some nights, I'd wake up thinking I heard breathing. Once, I found muddy footprints outside my flat in Glasgow, even though it hadn't rained that week. Eventually, I moved. I left Scotland entirely. I got a job in the south of England, near Bristol, and I don't go hunting anymore. I still go for hikes sometimes, but never alone. Never that far out. People say the wilderness is peaceful, clean, untouched. But the truth is, once you get far enough from everything, the rules start to bend. You're not in charge out there, and not everything that walks on two legs wants to be found. I never went back to Loch Scarich. I couldn't find it on the map if I tried, and that's probably for the best. It was late September of 2018. I had just turned 31 and was living in a cramped apartment in the southern outskirts of Milan. I worked in IT, mostly remote contracts, and it had been a stressful year. Long hours, difficult clients, and barely any time to step away from the screen. I promised myself for months I'd take a break and disconnect. When my last project wrapped up mid-September, I decided to go camping alone. I'd been camping plenty when I was younger, mostly in the Alps with my cousins, but it had been a few years since the last time I slept in a tent. I figured I'd find a quiet wooded area not far from Milan, somewhere remote enough to feel like I was away from everything, but still close enough that I could reach the city if I needed to. I picked a spot west of Lake Maggiore, just inside the edge of Lombardy. It wasn't a well-known area, nothing like the tourist-heavy lakeside towns. It was mostly hills and forests, small winding roads, and a few cabins here and there, some owned by locals, others by city people who came up for weekend getaways. I'd found a little patch on a hiking forum that someone had mentioned once. A clearing near a shallow stream, about a 20-minute hike from the nearest road. There wasn't any cell signal up there, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, a 2-person tent, a small gas stove, a couple of changes of clothes, some ready-to-eat food, a water purifier, flashlight, knife, a metal cup, and a few other small items. I didn't bother with luxuries. I left Milan early on a Wednesday morning, drove about an hour and a half northwest, and parked near an abandoned farmhouse just off a narrow country road. From there, I hiked in. The walk to the clearing took longer than I thought. I guessed 20 minutes, but it was closer to 40. The path was overgrown, more animal trail than hiking route, and my backpack was heavier than I expected. Still, I found the place without too much trouble. The clearing was about 15 meters wide, mostly soft moss and pine needles, with the stream running along one side and thick forest all around. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no far-off voices, no planes overhead, just wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, the stream gurgling. I set up camp near the edge of the clearing, close to the water. That first day went by peacefully. I spent the afternoon collecting dry wood, boiling water, and reading a paperback novel I'd brought with me. I watched the light fade through the trees and felt that weight lift off me. The pressure of deadlines, meetings, emails felt good. I cooked a simple meal, drank tea from my metal cup, and turned in early. The tent was cozy, and I fell asleep quickly. The second day started the same. Breakfast, a short hike, some more reading. I didn't see a single person all morning. Around midday, I walked farther up the trail, trying to find a vantage point with a better view. After an hour or so, I found a rocky ridge that looked over the valley. I sat there for a long while, eating trail mix and staring at the trees. When I finally made my way back down to the clearing, it was late afternoon. That's when I noticed something strange. Nothing obvious, just a feeling, like something had changed while I was gone. The clearing looked the same, the tent still zipped up, my little cooking area untouched. But it didn't feel the same. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired from the climb. That night, as I lay in the tent, I thought I heard something moving in the woods. Not animals, at least not the kind I was used to hearing. It was subtle, a crack of a branch, the soft rustle of something stepping through dry leaves. I held my breath and listened, then silence again. I told myself it was deer or a fox, maybe even a boar, though they usually made more noise. I stayed awake longer than I wanted to, flashlight in hand, straining my ears in the dark. The next morning was cold. The trees dripped from a light rain overnight, and the ground was damp. I went about my routine, boiled water, cleaned up the camp a bit, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I planned to stay 3 nights, but by mid-morning, I was already considering packing up early. Something felt off. I decided to explore the area a bit more, just to distract myself. I followed the stream upstream, climbing over mossy rocks and fallen logs. After maybe a kilometer, I found something unexpected. A crude fire pit, still surrounded by blackened stones and a few half-burnt sticks. Old but not ancient. Nearby, there was an improvised bench, just a thick log rolled beside a stump. That wasn't strange by itself. Hikers sometimes leave behind makeshift rest spots. but this one felt different. I looked closer and saw something else. The faint outline of a shoe print in the mud. Not mine. I didn't stay there long. I walked back to camp faster than I should have. My heart was beating hard, and I kept turning around to check behind me. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead. I stared at my tent, at the small pile of wood I'd stacked beside it. Took me a moment to register what was wrong. My knife, the one I kept strapped to my pack, was stuck into the ground next to the fire pit. I hadn't put it there. I froze. Everything around me was still. No birdsong, no wind, just a cold knot in my stomach. I stepped carefully toward the knife, crouched, and pulled it out. The soil was soft, so it hadn't taken much force to stick it in. But it hadn't fallen there by accident. Someone had done that. Someone had been at my camp while I was gone. I looked around the perimeter of the clearing. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. But the woods felt different now, like they were hiding something. I felt exposed. I didn't wait. I packed everything quickly, cramming gear into my backpack without folding or organizing. The tent came down in minutes. I didn't eat, didn't even drink. I just packed and left. The trail back to the car felt longer than before. Every crack of a branch made me whip my head around. I walked fast, almost jogging, pushing through the underbrush. The silence was heavier than before. Even the stream sounded muted. I reached the car around 3 in the afternoon. It was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing broken, no signs of tampering. I threw my pack into the trunk and climbed in. I locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the country road, I saw a man standing about 50 meters away, just off the edge of the woods. He wasn't on a trail, just standing between 2 trees, watching. He was thin, maybe mid-40s, unshaven. He wore a faded green jacket and dark pants. His posture was strange, too still. He didn't move when he saw me. He didn't wave. He just stared. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again and again, but the trees quickly swallowed the road behind me. I didn't go back to Milan right away. I stopped at a gas station about 30 minutes out, used the bathroom, and sat in the car for a long time. My hands were still trembling. I kept thinking about the knife, the shoe print, the man in the trees. That night, back in my apartment, I didn't sleep. I kept all the lights on. Every small sound outside made me sit up straight. I kept the windows closed and locked, even though it was warm. In the following days, I checked local news, forums, anything that might tell me something about the area. I found a few old posts warning hikers not to camp near that part of the forest. Some mentioned strange people living in the woods, off-grid. One post from 2016 talked about a couple who had been camping and returned to find their tent slashed open. They'd reported it to local authorities, but nothing came of it. I didn't report my experience. I didn't even tell my friends. I felt stupid, paranoid, but I knew what I saw. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to well-known trails now, campsites with other people around. I take my time setting up. I double-check locks. I sleep with a flashlight under my pillow. Sometimes I think about that man in the woods. I wonder if he was watching me the whole time, from the first night. Maybe he followed me from the road. Maybe he waited until I left camp to approach. Maybe he didn't mean harm. Maybe he was just curious. But the way he stood there, watching, motionless, it didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like he was waiting for something, or testing how far he could go. And I wonder, if I hadn't noticed the knife, if I hadn't packed up early, what would have happened that night? I'm glad I didn't find out. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I lived in Phoenix back then and worked at a warehouse loading trucks and stocking shelves. My schedule was always the same. Days bled into each other. I hadn't taken a vacation in over a year, and I needed something to clear my head. The idea of heading north, away from the noise, the lights, and the heat, started to seem more like a necessity than a getaway. It was late September 2017, still warm in Phoenix, but the high country had already cooled down. I packed light, sleeping bag, tent, small propane burner, a flashlight, a hatchet, a lighter, food that could last 4 or 5 days, and a few bottles of water. I also brought a filter pump for river water. I wasn't worried about wildlife or anything. I wasn't a rookie camper. I'd done trips with friends in high school and later on with coworkers. But this was my first time going alone. I picked a spot just outside a town called Heber. Not a popular tourist place, just a small mountain town off Highway 260. If you drove north from there for about 30 minutes along some old service roads, you'd eventually hit the Ridge Trail, an old path used by loggers back in the 60s, barely maintained but still hikeable. That's where I planned to make camp. The ridge was about 6,500 feet up, and you could see for miles from up there. Pines thickened around the trail as you got higher, and most people avoided it because the roads weren't in good shape. It took me about 3.5 hours to get from my apartment to the trailhead. I left early that morning, around 5, so I got there just after 8:30. I drove a silver 2006 Tacoma, not fancy, but reliable. There was an open patch off a service road where I could park the truck and hike the rest of the way up to the ridge. The plan was simple: camp 2 or 3 nights, hike down and head back. I locked up the truck, threw on my pack, and started up the trail. The ridge trail wasn't marked with signs, but I had an offline map and a GPS app on my phone. There was no service out there, so I downloaded everything ahead of time. The first hour of hiking was easy, mostly flat, pine needles crunching under my boots, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like your ears are ringing. A few deer scattered when they saw me. The air was cold but fresh. I reached the top of the ridge by late morning. The spot I chose to camp was maybe 100 yards off the main trail. It was flat, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides and a clear view of the valley to the west. I could see patches of yellow and orange in the trees below, early signs of fall. I dropped my pack and started setting up the tent. Took me half an hour. I stacked some rocks into a small fire ring and gathered some dry branches for later. The first day was quiet, peaceful. I walked along the ridge in the afternoon, took some pictures, and even saw a pair of elk off in the distance. I ate beans and rice that night, boiled some coffee, and watched the stars come out. The wind came in light gusts. I zipped myself into the tent and slept without much trouble. The next morning, I woke up to silence again, except for some rustling in the trees. I figured it was squirrels. The sun was barely rising, so I stayed in the tent for a while, just staring up at the ceiling of nylon above me. I remember how still it was, almost too still. Even in remote spots, you hear birds or insects or something, but it was dead quiet. I didn't think much of it then. After breakfast, I decided to hike further along the ridge. I brought a small day pack with some water and snacks and followed the trail north. I walked maybe 2 hours out before I decided to head back. Around halfway, I noticed something strange on the side of the trail. An old tarp, blue, half buried under some pine needles and dirt. It was torn at the edges like it had been flapping in the wind for years. I cleared some of the dirt and saw an old camping stove underneath it, rusted and broken. A few crushed cans too. Whoever left it must have been there a long time ago. I left it alone and kept walking. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A fresh boot print just outside the fire ring. It wasn't mine. I wore size 10 boots, and this was maybe 2 sizes bigger. The tread pattern didn't match either. I looked around for more prints but didn't see anything. I stood there, just staring at it for a while. I don't know how long. Eventually, I told myself it was probably someone passing through. maybe a hunter or another hiker, but the idea didn't sit right. The trail was overgrown, and I hadn't heard or seen a single person since I got there. Still, I tried to stay calm. I made a bigger fire that night, not because I was cold, but because the light made me feel safer. I kept the hatchet beside me as I ate. I didn't sleep as well that night. I kept hearing small snaps outside the tent, twigs cracking under weight. I told myself it was animals, but my mind wouldn't settle. At one point, sometime after midnight, I sat up in the tent and just listened. Nothing. No wind, no animals, no movement. That silence again, the kind that feels heavy. I laid back down but didn't close my eyes for hours. When I finally slept, it was light and dreamless. The next morning, I made a decision. I'd hike down the next day instead of staying longer. Something felt off. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like my body knew something my mind hadn't figured out yet. Later that afternoon, I walked to the edge of the ridge again, just to look out and think. From there, I saw something down in the woods below. Just movement, not clear. I watched for a long time. Trees swayed a little, but then I saw something step between two trunks. Person, definitely a person, not wearing hunter orange or any kind of gear, just standing there. I blinked and they were gone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire burning late and sat beside it, hatchet in my lap. My flashlight started to dim, so I used it sparingly. Every once in a while, I thought I saw something between the trees. Couldn't be sure. I was exhausted. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. Still, I kept hearing the crunch of steps. Just once or twice. Then silence, like someone testing how close they could get. By dawn, my hands were shaking. I packed everything fast, no breakfast, no coffee. Just stuffed it all in the bag. I didn't care if it was organized. I got moving. I kept checking behind me as I hiked down. Every 30 steps or so, I felt watched the whole way. When I got back to my truck, I almost cried. The doors were locked, windows intact. I climbed in and just sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead. That feeling didn't leave me until I was back on the highway, heading south. I didn't stop until I reached Payson, and even then I only pulled over to get gas and pee. Back home, I unpacked everything and stored it away. But for weeks, I kept thinking about that boot print, the figure in the woods, the silence. I looked up news from Heber, searched for missing persons or strange reports. Nothing. Just the usual backwoods stuff, occasional bear sightings, illegal hunting, that kind of thing. I haven't gone camping since. I tell people I just don't have the time, but that's not true. The truth is, I don't want to be out there anymore. Not alone. Not in places where you can scream and no one will hear you. I don't know what was out there with me. Maybe just a drifter, maybe someone living rough off the grid. But they saw me. They came close. Maybe they watched me sleep. Maybe they wanted me gone. Maybe they were waiting for something. And I'll never know how close it got to going the other way. All I know is I left. I made it back. And I'm not going back. It was the fall of 2016. I had just turned 32. And I was spending more time alone outdoors than ever. That year had been rough. I'd lost a contract job in May, and by September, my girlfriend of 3 years had decided she needed something else. So I was back to square one. Living in a small studio apartment in Greeley, Colorado, working part-time construction with my cousin, and trying to keep myself busy enough not to lose it completely. I'd always found peace in the woods. I grew up hunting with my dad around the White River National Forest, so I knew the area better than most. Late September was my favorite time of year, right before the snow started, when the trees had that deep golden tone and the air was cold enough to feel sharp but not miserable. I decided I was going to camp out for a few nights on my own, just me and my gear.
No distractions.
just get my head right again. I packed my truck on a Thursday morning, brought enough food for 4 days, my .30-06 rifle, a Glock, a hatchet, and some basic gear, stove, tarp, my 2-person tent, sleeping bag, and layers of clothes. I also carried a small satellite phone in case of an emergency. I wasn't new to this. I knew better than to go unprepared. By noon, I was on the road heading toward Flat Tops Wilderness, a remote area with enough space to get lost in without seeing another person for miles. It was almost 7 hours from where I lived, but that's what I wanted, complete distance from everything. I parked at a pull-off on a narrow forest road, County Road 8, I think, then hiked in about 3 miles with my pack. I didn't want to be close to anything marked. I took an unmarked game trail that I remembered from a trip years ago and set up camp by a small creek in a clearing surrounded by tall lodgepole pines and aspen trees. I got the tent up, started a small fire, and made some beans and rice for dinner. As the sun dipped, the cold moved in fast. The woods were quiet, that stillness you only get when you're really far out. No highway hum.
No plonso overhead.
Just wind in the trees and the occasional rustle from a squirrel or bird. That first night was peaceful. I remember waking up briefly around 3 a.m. to a distant snapping noise. Maybe a tree branch, maybe an elk. Nothing felt off, so I turned over and went back to sleep. The next day, I spent hiking further up the ridge past the creek. Found some elk sign, but nothing fresh. Still, I liked the solitude. I cooked oatmeal for breakfast, drank instant coffee, and just walked. I didn't even bother taking photos. I wasn't there for memories. I just needed to feel like myself again. That second night, though, something changed. I had finished dinner, pumpkin stew heated over the fire, and sat for a while watching the flames. The sky was clear, full of stars. Around 10 p.m., I packed the food away, double-bagged it, and hung it from a tree about 100 feet away. Standard bear precaution. I doused the fire, brushed my teeth with bottled water, and zipped into my sleeping bag. Maybe half an hour later, I started hearing noises. Not twigs snapping or wind blowing. These were footsteps. Not fast, not loud, but deliberate. They came from up the ridge behind my tent. I didn't move, just listened. There were 3 steps, then silence, then 2 more, slower, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat up slowly, reached for my Glock, and stayed still. It's hard to explain, but I felt watched. The footsteps stopped for maybe a full minute. Then I heard them again off to the side. Whatever it was had circled halfway around my tent. It wasn't an elk, they move heavy and fast. This thing was quiet, careful. Then came the smell, a sudden wave of something rotting, like a mix of wet dog and spoiled meat. I held my breath. It was strong, not lingering, like it passed through the air quickly and left me gagging. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could, pistol in one hand, flashlight in the other. I clicked the light on and swept the woods. Nothing, but the smell was still faint and the air had changed. Everything had gone still again, unnaturally still. I stepped out barefoot, keeping my body low, trying to stay quiet. I scanned the tree line in all directions. Nothing moved. I stayed out there for almost 10 minutes, barely breathing. Then I went back in, zipped the tent shut, and kept the Glock next to me inside the bag. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found tracks. Not boot prints, not paws, just weird shapes, almost like human feet but longer. Toes spread wider, and the stride was inconsistent. Some steps were close together, others far apart. Whatever it was had walked within 10 feet of my tent. I decided to stay. Maybe it was a bear with a mangled paw. Maybe a hunter screwing around. I don't know what I was thinking. By that evening, I was on edge. I made a bigger fire and kept it going longer, well into the night. Around midnight, the noises came back. More footsteps, this time on the opposite side of camp. Again slow, almost taunting, like it wanted me to know it was there. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it into the trees, my hand trembling. The light hit something. Eyes, not glowing like in movies, but definitely reflective. Too high off the ground for a deer, too narrow for a bear. The eyes blinked, then disappeared behind a tree. I shouted into the woods. Not words, just a loud burst of noise, but no response. I didn't hear anything run. It was just gone. The smell returned a few minutes later. Faint, then strong, then faint again like something circling. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the fire burning and the pistol in my lap. By sunrise, I was done. I packed my gear as fast as I could, barely eating. I didn't even try to take down the tent properly. I stuffed it into my pack and started hiking. About a mile in, I felt it again, being watched. I turned and saw something move behind a tree. A figure, tall, skinny, pale. It stepped out just long enough for me to see the shape of a person. Bare skin, maybe 6.5 feet tall, but wrong somehow. The arms were too long. The head tilted too far to one side. I froze. It didn't move like an animal or a person. It moved like something trying to pretend to be both. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. I wasn't following the trail anymore. I just ran downhill, tripping over rocks and crashing through brush. Eventually, I saw the road. My truck was still there. I jumped in, locked the doors, and just sat for a second, trying to breathe. I looked up the ridge and saw nothing. I drove nonstop back to Greeley. Didn't eat until I got home. Slept with the lights on for 3 nights straight. I told myself it was a mountain lion, a guy messing with me, maybe a hallucination. But I know what I saw. A few weeks later, I was grabbing coffee with my cousin who does volunteer SAR work in the area. I casually mentioned the location and asked if they'd ever seen anything weird up there. He got real quiet. Then he told me they'd had a hiker disappear in that area the year before. A woman in her 40s. Never found a trace. He also mentioned they'd found strange prints around her last known site. Not boots, not paws, just strange. I didn't ask for more. I didn't want to know. I haven't camped alone since. I still go out in the woods sometimes, but only for day hikes and only in well-marked areas. If I stay out, it's in a cabin or a camper with others nearby. I don't tell this story to scare people. I tell it because people need to know how far the wilderness can go, how quiet and empty the woods really are, and what might be watching from just beyond the trees. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't some myth or ghost story. It was flesh and blood, real, and it watched me for hours. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know why it let me go, but I'll never forget how it moved, how it smelled, how it stared. That thing wasn't pretending to be human. It was something else trying to wear our shape. And it got close, way too close, and I was lucky to walk away. It had been 3 months since my grandfather passed. He was 81, the kind of man who didn't talk much but always had this quiet strength about him. He'd raised me for a while when I was younger, back when my parents were working too much and had little time for anything else. I was 32 when he died, and something about it left this huge hollow space in my chest. I didn't cry at the funeral, not because I wasn't sad, but because the weight of everything just hadn't hit me all at once. Instead, it came in waves. His old coat still hanging behind my bedroom door. The empty space in the corner of his recliner when I visited my mom. The smell of his old pickup that I'd ended up with after the will was read. His name was George Keller. Lived his whole life in western Pennsylvania, mostly up near a small town called Kane. When I was little, he used to take me camping up in the Allegheny National Forest. Not the campgrounds either. He had this spot he always referred to as the clearing. It wasn't on any official maps, and I couldn't tell you the exact GPS location even now. We used to just drive his truck down a logging road, pull off into some tight trail that barely looked passable and hike about a mile into the woods. I hadn't been back there in over a decade. After the funeral, life just felt like it was grinding forward without me. I had a desk job at a small insurance firm, mostly spent my days going through spreadsheets, checking for discrepancies, following up with clients. I wasn't unhappy, but there was this heaviness behind everything I did. Like the days were just gray, even when the sun was out. I kept thinking about the woods, that old clearing. So one night in late September, I packed a bag, tossed my gear into the bed of my truck, and headed north. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I left a note on my kitchen counter, just in case something happened. Told myself it was just a quick camping trip, nothing serious. I took Friday and Monday off, figuring I'd spend the weekend out there and come back before work. The drive took about 4 hours. The farther I got from Pittsburgh, the more I started to recognize things. Certain curves in the road, a rusted metal bridge over a narrow creek, an old gas station that had changed signs but not much else. The last stretch was the hardest to remember. That's where I had to slow down, scan the trees, and hope some old instinct would kick in. It took me about an hour of creeping down dirt paths and turning around more times than I can count. But eventually I found what I was looking for. A break in the brush that led down a path barely wide enough for the truck. I pulled in, parked in a space that probably hadn't seen a vehicle in years, and grabbed my gear. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. I mean, I know the woods are supposed to be quiet, but this was different.
No birdsong, no squirrels skittering.
Just wind moving through the trees and the sound of my boots on the ground. It was just before sunset when I reached the clearing. It was still there, still open, ringed by tall trees that had grown even taller since I was a kid. There were a few logs pushed up around the space from when Grandpa used to make a sitting circle near the fire. Moss had taken over parts of them, and the whole space felt untouched. I set up my small tent, unpacked my food, and got a fire going with dry wood I gathered. Felt good, peaceful, even like stepping back into a memory. I could almost hear Grandpa's heavy steps nearby, smell his old flannel shirts and the bacon he used to cook on his rusted little pan. I ate a canned meal, drank some water, and sat there watching the fire until the sky turned black. I slept light that first night. The wind picked up around midnight, and I kept waking up to the sound of branches creaking. Nothing unusual, but enough to keep my mind alert. I had brought a hatchet and a small fixed-blade knife just in case. When you're alone in the woods, it's smart to have something. Saturday morning was crisp. I woke up to a heavy fog. Everything was damp, even under the tarp I'd set up over the firewood pile. I boiled water for coffee, sat on a log, and watched the fog burn off. Around mid-morning, I decided to explore. I followed one of the old deer trails Grandpa used to walk, just taking my time, soaking everything in. Felt good to move. About a half mile from the clearing, I found something that hadn't been there before. A trail camera strapped to a tree. Newer model, camo pattern, infrared lens. Not something Grandpa would have ever used. I looked around and spotted a second one, maybe 20 feet down. They were spaced evenly, both facing in toward the same direction. Curious, I followed the line. The cameras kept going, each strapped about 6 feet high every 100 feet or so, always pointing east. Eventually, the line led me to something I absolutely didn't expect. A small, homemade cabin. Not even really a cabin, more like a shack. It had been built recently. The boards were still pale, unweathered. The door was shut, and there were no windows, just a vent at the top. It looked like it had been made fast, maybe in a hurry, but it wasn't falling apart. It had intention behind it. I didn't go inside, didn't even get too close. Something about it made me stop. I looked around, no vehicle tracks, no signs of someone living there currently, but the ground nearby was worn in patches. Someone had been moving around here recently, I backtracked to the clearing, moving slower now. My mind was running too fast. Why all the trail cameras? Why here, of all places? Back at camp, I took a mental inventory of everything. Nothing had been touched, nothing moved, but the peace I'd felt earlier was gone. That night, I kept the fire low. I didn't cook anything that would make a smell. I didn't light my lantern. I just sat near the fire, listening. And I heard something. It wasn't an animal. The steps were deliberate, not like a deer or a bear. It was far off, but close enough that I could tell it was 2 legs. And it stopped and started again in patterns, 3 steps, then nothing, then 5, then silence. I sat there, gripping the handle of the hatchet, heart pounding in my ears. Whatever or whoever it was, they didn't come any closer that night. But I didn't sleep much. Sunday morning, I packed early. I didn't tear down the whole camp. I just stashed my tent and gear under a fallen log, buried it with leaves, and set off again. I wanted to find out more about that cabin. Instead of taking the same route as before, I moved parallel to it, staying out of sight of the cameras. Took me a little longer, but I got there. The shack door was open. I froze. Not wide open, just cracked. Enough to see inside. There was a cot against the wall, a folded wool blanket, a metal cup, and a small propane stove. Someone had been living there. Maybe still was. I didn't go in. I backed away, scanned the ground again. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen the first time. Boot prints, maybe a dozen of them, circling the shack, and a narrow path heading east. I followed it. About a quarter mile in, I came to a spot that made my stomach drop. It was a low gully, and someone had been digging. Fresh dirt, pile of rocks, and buried halfway under that dirt was something I wish I'd never seen. The carcass of a dog, collapsed in a way that didn't look like natural death. I didn't get closer, couldn't. I turned around and headed straight back to the clearing. I didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just wanted out, but I wasn't alone. On my way back, I saw someone, just for a second. A man, maybe 40 yards to my left, standing behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't stop walking, didn't look back. I got to my truck, jumped in, and didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove the whole way home without stopping. Didn't eat, didn't call anyone. I locked the doors when I got home, pulled the shades, and sat in silence. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me, that I'd brought something back with me. I checked my truck every morning, changed my locks, watched the streets outside my apartment at night, but nothing ever happened. Eventually, the fear faded. The memories stayed, but they lost their sharpness. Still, I never went back to the clearing, and I never told anyone the full story until now. What scared me most wasn't the cabin, or the trail cams, or even the dead dog. It was the way the man just watched without coming closer, like he wasn't surprised to see me, like he'd seen others before me. Whatever he was doing out there, I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did, and I won't ever go back. I was 35 the summer I decided to take a week off and drive up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had just quit my job at an accounting firm in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I hadn't lined up another job yet. I didn't have a wife or kids, and I figured it might be my last chance in a while to disappear into the woods without having to worry about anything else. I'd always been into camping, ever since I was a teenager. My uncle used to take me out to state forests every summer, and I picked up most of what I know about the outdoors from him. After he passed away a few years earlier, I started going alone. It helped me clear my head. This trip wasn't supposed to be complicated. I packed my gear, threw it in the back of my Jeep, and planned a simple route. I'd head up through Grand Rapids, cut over to Manistee, and then camp in the Hiawatha National Forest for 5 or 6 days. No real plans, just hike, fish and be left alone. The kind of trip where you don't even check your phone. The first 2 nights were fine. I found a spot by a small lake just south of Munising. It was quiet, no one around. I didn't see another person the whole time I was there. I'd brought enough food for the first few days, some canned stuff, trail mix, jerky, the usual, and I used a camp stove I'd had since college. I set up my tent near the tree line, just far enough from the water to avoid the bugs. Every night, I heard the owls and the wind moving through the branches, and I slept hard. On the 3rd morning, I decided I wanted a change of scenery. I packed up camp and figured I'd drive another hour east, maybe explore around the Pictured Rocks area. There were enough trails out that way to keep me occupied for days. That's when I made a decision I regret. I was following this 2-lane road that ran east-west. Not a highway, just one of those local roads with no name, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. At some point, I saw a small wooden sign, half hidden behind a tree. It said Cranberry Hollow Trail 6 miles, with an arrow pointing down a dirt road. I pulled over and checked the map. I didn't see anything labeled Cranberry Hollow on it, but that wasn't unusual. These woods are full of old trails, some of them barely used. The road looked decent enough, packed gravel with a few ruts. I figured it would take me to a remote trailhead, maybe an old logging site where I could camp in peace. I turned down the road. The first mile or so was fine. The trees leaned in close, and the branches overhead made a tunnel of green. I had the windows down, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the car. I passed a faded mile marker and then a gate that had been pulled off to the side, probably used to block the road in winter. About 2 miles in, the road started getting worse. The gravel turned to dirt, and the ruts got deeper. I slowed to a crawl, weaving around potholes and tree roots. My GPS lost signal completely. I stopped once to check the map again, but I still couldn't find the trail. I thought maybe I'd driven too far. I kept going, hoping it would open up into a trailhead or clearing. I don't know why I didn't just turn around. Eventually, the road narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the Jeep. The ground was soft, and I felt the wheels sinking a little. Just when I thought I'd have to back out, the trees opened up. I pulled into a wide clearing, flat, ringed with tall pines. In the middle was an old fire ring made of stones. A couple rusted metal cans sat nearby, crushed and faded. It looked like no one had camped there in years, but it was perfect for what I needed. Quiet, off-grid, peaceful. I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing, where the trees were thickest. I cleared a patch, laid down a tarp, and built my shelter. I unpacked the rest of my gear and set up a small cooking area near the fire ring. That night, I sat by the fire I made and stared up through the trees. No sounds except for a few insects and the wind moving low through the branches. I ate cold chili out of a can and sipped water from my thermos. I felt completely alone, and I liked it. It wasn't until the next morning that I started to feel something was wrong. I woke up early. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but the sky had that pale blue color that comes just before dawn. I was about to unzip my tent when I noticed something outside, just a little off. The fire pit, the one I used the night before, had been disturbed. It wasn't dramatic, just a few rocks shifted, but I remembered exactly how I placed them. I had stacked them in a ring almost perfect. One was missing, another was moved aside. There were no footprints around it, but the dirt was soft, and anything could have wiped them away. I got out and looked around the camp. Nothing else was touched. My food was sealed and stored. My pack was where I left it, and there weren't any animal tracks. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I spent the day hiking through the woods around the clearing, trying to find the trail that was supposed to be nearby. I never found it. The woods were dense and full of deadfall, and it felt like no one had come through in years. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in my tent with a headlamp and read a book. I kept the zipper cracked open to let in air, but I checked over my shoulder every few minutes. Just before I fell asleep, I heard something. It was soft, a rustling sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Something slower, more deliberate, like someone stepping through the underbrush and then stopping. I sat up and listened. Nothing. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake for hours, waiting to hear it. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't want to stick around and figure out what that sound was. I packed my tent, loaded the Jeep, and tried to drive back the way I came. That's when I realized the road was gone. I don't mean completely gone. The trees were still parted, and there was still a trail where my tires had come in. But the road itself, the hard ground, the packed dirt, it was different, softer,
better.
It looked like it hadn't been driven on in years. I put the Jeep in gear and started out. Less than 100 feet in, I hit a patch of mud and the wheels sank in deep. I tried to reverse. Nothing. I rocked it, forward and back, like I'd done 100 times before in snow and sand. But it didn't move. The rear wheel spun, spraying mud up into the air. The more I tried, the deeper it sank. I got out, walked around, and saw that the whole stretch ahead was worse. Even if I got out of that first rut, the road beyond was flooded and soft. The only option was to go back to the clearing and wait for the ground to dry out or hike out. I spent the rest of the day trying to get a signal on my phone. I climbed small ridges, walked back along the road, even held the phone up on a long stick. Nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going even though I didn't want to. I needed the light. Every sound in the woods sounded closer. Every branch that snapped made me flinch. I kept my hatchet close. At one point in the middle of the night, I saw something move. It was just beyond the firelight, something shifting between the trees. It was tall, not a bear, not a deer, taller than a man, just a shape. It didn't come closer and it didn't run. It just stood there, half hidden by the trees, and then it was gone. I stayed by the fire until sunrise. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I packed a bag, took water, my compass, and enough food for a day, and started walking west, back toward the main road, or where I thought it should be. I walked for hours. The trees never broke. No roads, no signs, no sounds of cars. Just endless forest. I kept checking the compass, kept moving west, but the landscape never changed. At some point in the afternoon, I found something strange. It was an old shack, not a cabin, just a rough structure made of planks and sheet metal. The roof was caved in on one side. It looked abandoned. I approached slowly, expecting to find nothing inside but maybe some trash or a few old tools. Inside, there was a chair, a table, a rotted sleeping bag, and on the walls, dozens of marks, like someone had been carving lines into the wood. Hundreds of them. I didn't count, but it looked like someone had been there for a long time. I didn't stay. I kept moving. It wasn't until near dark that I found the road again. It wasn't the same road I drove in on. It was wider, better maintained, and at the edge of it, I saw a wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read trail maintenance, authorized vehicles only. I followed it south, and after 2 more miles, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. Parked truck, a forestry vehicle. It was empty, but the radio inside was on. I waited there, near the truck, for almost 2 hours before a man in a uniform appeared from the woods. He was shocked to see me. He said no one was supposed to be that deep in the reserve.
No trails, no campsites.
Just protected land and swamp. He gave me a ride back to a ranger station. I explained where I'd been. He shook his head and said I must have taken a wrong turn. There was no Cranberry Hollow trail. Nothing by that name on the maps. I reported the Jeep, and 2 days later, a team recovered it with a winch. It was almost buried in the mud by then. They said I was lucky to get out on foot. That was 5 years ago. I don't go camping alone anymore. I still think about that shape I saw in the trees. I still think about the marks on the wall of that shack. I wonder how long someone stayed there. I wonder if they ever got out. I never found that sign again. I drove that same stretch of road a year later, just to see if I could find the turnoff. It wasn't there. Sometimes the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes it doesn't want you to leave. It was October of 2016. I was 32 back then, and living alone in a rented flat in Nottingham. I had no partner, no pets, and a job I didn't care about. I'd been working as a warehouse supervisor since I dropped out of college. Life was all right, but it felt like I was watching it go by instead of being part of it. So I started hiking on weekends. Nothing dramatic, just long walks in the Peak District or into Wales when I could spare the time. That autumn, I decided to try something different. Solo camping. I'd never done it before. I wasn't some hardened outdoorsman, but I figured I'd done enough walking to handle a night alone. I didn't want a campsite with toilets and people around. I wanted proper quiet. Real quiet. Just me, the trees, and whatever the weather threw at me. I bought a used one-man tent, a cheap gas stove, a sleeping bag rated for -5 degrees Celsius, and a rucksack to carry it all. I figured I'd start with one night and see how I felt. If I liked it, I'd go longer next time. I picked an area up in Northumberland. Not in the main park area where everyone goes, but east of Kielder Forest, near the edge of an old disused logging trail I'd read about on a hiking forum. Someone posted a photo from there a few years ago. Dense pines, wet moss, not a soul around. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The post said the trail hadn't been used in decades and wasn't marked on official maps anymore, but you could still get to it if you knew where to look. So on a Saturday morning, I loaded up my rucksack, filled my thermos with coffee, and drove 3 hours north. By noon, I'd left my car in a muddy lay-by off a narrow road no one uses anymore and started walking. The rain had started that morning and hadn't let up, just that steady British drizzle that soaks you slowly. The trail was easy enough to follow at first, a narrow path with thick underbrush on either side and tall trees pressing in. Everything was slick with wet leaves, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. I passed an old rusted gate about 2 miles in, half buried in the ground with some moss-covered timber stacked beside it, probably leftovers from when the place was still being logged. After nearly 3 hours of walking, I found a good flat spot off the trail under a cluster of old pine trees. The forest was thick, dark, and damp. I liked it. It didn't feel haunted or spooky, just real. I pitched my tent quickly. It wasn't hard, just 4 pegs and 2 poles. I laid my roll mat down, unzipped the sleeping bag, and dumped the rest of my gear inside. By the time I was done, it was past 4 and already getting darker under the clouds. The rain picked up a bit, so I crouched under a makeshift tarp I tied between 2 trees and boiled some water for a packet of soup. I didn't have much appetite, but I forced it down. I wanted to make sure I had energy. I hadn't expected how exhausting walking with a full pack would be. The wind picked up around 6. Not strong, just enough to make the trees creak. I remember sitting there under the tarp, watching the branches sway, feeling completely alone. It was a good kind of alone at first. I crawled into the tent around 7, peeled off my wet socks, and changed into dry thermals. I listened to the rain for a while, steady and rhythmic against the nylon. It was peaceful, that kind of white noise that makes you feel like the world's gone quiet for a while. I didn't bring a book or any music. I wanted it that way. I lay there for a long time, not thinking about anything, just letting my brain slow down. I must have fallen asleep around 9. I woke up about 2 hours later, not because of any sound, just that sudden feeling like something had changed. You know when you wake up in the night and the air feels heavier, like the pressure shifted? That's what it was like. I checked my watch just past 11. Still raining, but something didn't feel right. I lay there listening. The rain had eased off slightly, but it wasn't quiet. There was this sound like something soft dragging against the ground. Not close, just barely audible through the rain. A kind of wet sliding noise, like fabric brushing over soaked leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a fox, but the noise didn't move like an animal. It was too smooth, too drawn out, like something was being pulled. I stayed still. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there listening. The sound stopped after a while. I don't know how long. Could have been a minute, could have been 10. I waited a bit longer, then told myself I was being stupid. I took a few deep breaths and went back to sleep. But it happened again. Around 1:30, same sound, dragging, slower this time, closer. This time I sat up. I didn't turn on my torch. I didn't want to make noise. I just sat there in the dark, heart pounding. My hands were shaking. I couldn't explain why. I'd heard foxes before, deer too, but this sound wasn't like them. There was no rustling, no steps, just the dragging. Stopped again and I waited. When I finally did flick on the torch, the inside of the tent lit up instantly. Nothing inside, of course. The walls were thin, and I could see the shadows of trees outside. Nothing moved, just that soft hiss of rain on the tarp. I didn't sleep again after that. I lay there until dawn, torch in hand, eyes on the roof of the tent. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Everything was damp and gray. The trees looked even taller in the fog. I checked the area around the tent. Nothing unusual. No footprints, no marks, nothing out of place. But then I walked about 20 feet in the direction I thought the sound came from. That's when I saw the old boot print. Just one. Pressed into the mud beside a half-rotted tree stump. Big, probably size 11 or 12. No tread I recognized. Just a solid rubber sole with a thick edge, the kind you'd see on work boots. It was already filling with rainwater. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself it was old, that someone had come through here weeks ago and left it. But the mud around it wasn't disturbed, not like it should have been if it had been there for days. The edges were still sharp, and the indent was clean. I backed away from it slowly, packed up in record time, shoved everything into my bag without caring how wet it was, left my half-used fuel canister behind. Just wanted to move. I didn't take the trail back. I didn't want to walk past that boot print again. I used the compass on my watch and cut straight east through the trees, figuring I'd eventually hit the road. It was slow going. The rain picked up again, and the ground was slick. I slipped twice, nearly twisted my ankle. Every time a branch snapped behind me, I turned. Every time the wind moved the trees, I panicked. After nearly 2 hours of bushwhacking, I stumbled onto the road, about a mile from where I'd parked. My legs were soaked, my fingers numb. I've never been so happy to see tarmac. I drove straight home, didn't stop for coffee, didn't eat, didn't sleep that night either. I kept thinking about that sound, that dragging, and the boot print. One single print, no other marks around it. No sign of someone walking up to it or away from it. Just that one, pressed deep into the earth like someone had been standing there for a long time. And here's the thing that stuck with me. You don't leave a single boot print unless you're standing still. Not walking, not running, just standing, watching. I told myself I'd never go back there. But 2 weeks later I did. Not to camp, just to look. I parked in the same lay-by and followed the trail again. This time I brought gloves, a knife, and a friend. I told him I just wanted to show him a good hiking spot. I didn't tell him what happened. We found the same clearing and everything looked normal. Except one thing. About 10 feet from where my tent had been, the bark on one of the trees had been stripped away. Not by an animal, not scratched, peeled, about chest height, maybe 4 feet across, clean like it had been done with a blade. Fresh. The inner would still pale. I told him it was nothing. Wind damage, maybe, but I knew better. That night in bed, I couldn't stop picturing someone standing there in the dark, watching me sleep through thin nylon walls, not saying a word, just listening. I haven't camped alone since. Not once. I still hike, still walk the woods, but I sleep indoors now. Hotels, cabins, anywhere with a lock on the door. I still don't know what I heard that night. I didn't see a face. I didn't find a trail, but something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. It was someone, and whoever it was, they were standing very still, in the rain, watching, waiting, not saying a thing.